evening, everybody. Welcome to another live episode of The Breakdown. It is October 15th. We're only 2 short weeks away from we're going to find out how far this province can go when the wheels have truly come off, because the new legislative session kicks off the day before Halloween, October 30th. It's going to be fun. We took last weekend off because of the holiday weekend. And we got a little bit of catch up to do. So this is going to be a monster, supersized, strap in, make some popcorn, get a nice big water bottle, all of the things, because we got a lot of ground to cover. We're going to do our average, regular, weekly Roundup thinger. And then we're going to go to the open mic. So if you want to make notes as you go along to tell us all the things that we got wrong or that you disagree with, then you can do that, because we're all about the conversation here. But getting right into it, we got to follow up on a thing that we talked about last live episode. We're talking about the fees for pharmacists for vaccinations. Some of you might remember on our last live episode, we had a whole thing where we talked about the fact that the provincial government had made the decision with nary a day's notice that they were going to be changing how much pharmacists got paid for doing vaccinations. Now, this gets to be a little bit complicated, a little bit quick. So in order to help make a little bit of sense of things, we're going to bring up the memo that the pharmacists released, because it'll hopefully help make a bit more sense of things. So on September 29th, the Pharmacists Association released a special edition of their newsletter, The Capsule, where they announced a fee reduction for COVID shots. Alberta Health announced changes to reduce the fee for administration of COVID-19 vaccination to $17 effective October 1st, 2023, so a day later, and $13 on April 1st, 2024. Now, you might be wondering, well, how much of a reduction actually is that? It depends on the time of day. So originally, back in 2020, there was a fee that was negotiated of $25, but that was later changed to $25 for weekdays, peak business days, with a premium of $35 for vaccination for doses administered on weekends and holidays. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because one of the things that pharmacists have to take into consideration is they're more than just vaccine machines. They have prescriptions to fill. They have health advice to give. Pharmacists have a lot of different hats that they wear in the course of their day. And so if they're doing high demand vaccinations, then one of the things that happens is their other workload starts to get offset. In order to fix that, you got to bring on more staff. In order to pay for the more staff, you need to be able to make a little bit more money to cover the expenses of those staffs. That's the whole reason why those fees were initially increased. The good news is, after quite a bit of outcry from a good number of people, the provincial government said, okay, just kidding. So the next day, pretty much, the health minister's office informed the Pharmacists Association that the planned implementation of the COVID-19 vaccine reduction will be delayed until January 1st, 2024. So at least we get through the holiday season, the peak respiratory virus season, the peak COVID season. We're going to be talking about the COVID numbers a little bit later on. At least for while that whole machine is ramping up, people have the opportunity to still get vaccinated. Pharmacists have the opportunity to still get that increased fee. So it's a bit of a win. We wanted to start with something happy, because the rest of tonight is I'm not saying that the T-shirt choice is themed tonight, but it's a little bit themed tonight. We're going to start to get into that right away, because one of the other big stories that broke this week had to do with, again, the COVID situation, the respiratory virus situation, and it had to do with masking. And it got really, really confusing really quick, which for a major policy change probably isn't the best way for things to go. Alberta Health announced that there was going to be a new Alberta Health Services policy that said, this came out October 11th, 2023, a new policy that says, hey, you know what? The masking thing, it's so unique. Everybody has their different little things that they have to be concerned about and worried about. So, we don't want to go making decisions. Plus, it's not like Danielle Smith has said that she's going to decentralize all of the decision making that exists in Alberta Health Services. Here's the first taste of that. And that's exactly what happened, because the new policy states that it's site specific as to whether or not mandatory masking and in what areas mandatory masking will be a thing. So, for example, if a facility, let's say a hospital, like the Peter Lougheed, says, "Oh, we got this COVID problem. It's out of control. We got to do masking. We got to all of our people are going to wear masks. All of the people who come into the emergency room, they got to wear masks. Anybody visiting the hospital, they got to wear masks. That's good. We got to do the masking here at the Peter Lougheed." That's a decision for the Peter Lougheed. There's nothing saying that any other hospital or any other healthcare facility in the immediate area has to do the same thing. So Airdrie Urgent Care could say, "Well, we're not going to mask," which doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a whole bunch of reasons. Certainly when you're talking about smaller sites, rural sites, nobody's traveling to Raymond, Alberta to visit the hospital as opposed to going to Lethbridge. But when you're talking about those smaller sites, having some latitude there perhaps makes some sense. But when you're talking about major municipalities where millions, upwards over 1 million in some circumstances, of people live, having varied policies is only going to generate more confusion. Now, the policy has been justified by people saying, "Well, you know what? We want people to be able to make their own decisions." And masking is such a sensitive issue. But it's for exactly that reason that consistency is so important. Because somebody could very easily go to an emergency room where masking isn't required and then have to visit a family member during the holidays at a long-term care facility where masking is required. And that can turn into, because of the sensitivity that's been generated by way too much politics on what is actually medical science, people might not be willing to take those precautions. And we saw multiple reports where people were saying, "Oh, you know what? It's fantastic. Masking's back. We got masking back in acute care centers." And then a lot of people went, "Oh, wait, no, masking's not back. There's just a pathway to make masking back, but it's not going to come down from the big chunk. It's going to be the little chunks that are making these decisions." It got so confusing that Alberta Health Services had to publicly release a frequently asked questions where they explained point by point, when can a site implement enhanced masking? Who does this directive apply to? Where do I need to wear a mask when the directive is implemented at my site? When else is masking required? All of these questions that were generated because the policy is inordinately complex. Now, the good news is, as we're starting to see the masking situation and the COVID situation ramp up, the good news is we are starting to see some sites utilize this policy. The Royal Alexandra Hospital has implemented masking in their acute care settings, active treatment centers, diagnostic treatment centers, orthopedic surgery center, women's building, children's center, anywhere that a staff member is coming in contact with patients, they need to wear a mask. And it makes a lot of sense when you take a look at what's going on with the province, with the respiratory virus season. Now, it's important to note, there's a lot of people who have said that that term respiratory virus season is a little bit misleading because it implies that this is all normal. And we've certainly seen no shortage of people who have tried to make equivalent. It's a normal flu season. It's just, that's what it is. And there's a lot of people who have said, it's flu, it's influenza. It's pretty much the same thing. Former premiers aside, the numbers simply don't hold that up. When we take a look at how many cases we've seen this season of influenza, according to the province's dashboard, this is data that exists from October 1st, 2023 to October 7th, 2023. We're going to take a look at the whole seasonal numbers in just a sec. There have been 37 influenza cases in that 1 week period for a total of 128 this season. Now, when you compare that to COVID, which has worse outcomes, there were 157 cases in that period, according to the AHS dashboard, and almost 3,355 cases so far this season starting as of August. The positivity rates also radically different. Influenza, 1.4%. COVID, 16.9%. The number of influenza patients who required hospital admission, 7. The number of COVID patients who required hospital admission in that 1 week period, 145. There were no patients that required ICU admission for influenza, and there were 7 in that 1 week period for COVID. There has been 1 flu death this entire season, and it didn't happen in the last week. There were 8 in the last week, 57 this season. And when you take a look at the cumulative numbers, it's not a whole lot better. 3,355 cases of COVID this year, 742 hospitalizations. Sorry, I shouldn't say this year. I should say this season because of the way that they're counting the numbers. 742 hospitalizations this season for COVID. And these are not with COVID. These are because of COVID. This is one thing that the dashboard makes very clear. So that whole argument that we used to have people throw up where they would say, oh, well, you know what, though? They could have just been, they had COVID and also a gunshot wound to the head, so maybe they died of a gunshot wound. No, that's not what we're talking about here. The way the dashboard has been refined, the way that it's defined over the Alberta Health website, it's very clear. These are outcomes because of COVID, because of influenza. There have been 57 deaths since the end of August. We're talking about a 1-month period. Month and change. From COVID. 1 from influenza. And when we take a look at the projections look like, what the curve looks like, you can see the total weekly laboratory confirmed COVID cases in Alberta. That's a pretty steep climb. It's not a small climb at all. We are at more than almost triple the numbers of lab-confirmed cases that we were at the beginning of the season. So this thing is moving, and it's moving quite quickly. But again, this is another one of the areas where we have the people in the positions of power are doing everything that they can to downplay the severity of the situation. And while it's true that the strains, the flavors of COVID that are out there now are less killy than the original flavor of COVID that circulated way back in 2020, there very clearly are still negative outcomes. And there very clearly is an impact on the healthcare system. And there's lots of anecdotal reports that are going on about emergency rooms closing because they don't have staff. We're starting to see anecdotal reports circulating again about multiple times in the last week where across the province, there were no ambulances available. It's important to remember that one of the biggest reasons why healthcare or health protections were put in place in the first place was not just because, hey, it would be great if people didn't get sick. It was also because the healthcare system in Alberta is arguably running on a very, very, very tight track. And it doesn't take very much to throw that track off in really big ways. And the anecdotal reports that have been circulating through social media and in mainstream media as well, of there being no ambulances available for periods of time means that because the healthcare system is so taxed, if you have a loved one who's having a heart attack, who's having a stroke, who's gotten into a car accident, or God forbid, if a plane falls out of the sky, there are no ambulances available to deal with those situations. That's the whole reason why taking precautions and getting immunized is so important. We're going to talk a little bit more about COVID and healthcare in a bit, but we're going to move on from there because there's some other things that we need to talk about that are also deeply, deeply horrifying. We're going to talk about the drug toxicity situation in the province of Alberta. Newly released data from Alberta's health ministry shows 168 people died from drug poisonings in July of this year. While that's 2 fewer deaths than the month before, it's the highest number of deaths of any July on record. And when you compare it to the same month last year, so July of 2022, it's actually up by 45 deaths. These are some very helpful little graphs that were put together by Kira Markov from CTV Edmonton. This graph that we have here, for those of you that are listening on the Twitter Spaces, you should go check out Kira's Twitter threads because she details all of this incredibly well. But the graphs that we have here, you can see it looks like almost during the start of COVID, the drug deaths they started dropping down in July. So 2020, we had 163. 2021, we had 146. Last year's was the lowest. We're back up to 168 for this year. And the overall trend for the first 7 months of the year has 2023 being the most for the first 7 months of the year. Now, all of this comes at a time where Danielle Smith and Marshall Smith, no relation, are doing their very, very best to talk about the Alberta model and how the Alberta model is the highlight of the world. It also comes at a time, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later in some more detail, where the UCP is actually calling for complete defunding of supervised consumption sites across the province of Alberta. The Alberta model isn't working. Forcing people into abstinence-based treatment only doesn't work. We've had multiple conversations with people on the show who have actual expertise, actual education, actual background, have done the work of being out on the streets, have done the work of doing outreach. And every single one of those people that we've spoken to has said harm reduction isn't about just abstinence, because there's a lot of people who aren't ready for abstinence. And if you try to make that the only option, people are going to die. And the numbers that we're seeing in Alberta certainly seem to hold that tragically to be true. Moving on from there. Danielle Smith and the Tell the Feds campaign. We got to tell the feds, the demands that you're making, they're so unfair. This net zero electric grid by 2035. It's unreasonable. It's we're gonna talk to the whole country, and by the whole country, it appears that the $8 million that's being spent on a social media campaign and driving trucks with banners on the side and putting up digital ads across the province, not only on digital billboards, but on Facebook, on all forms of social media, on children's games, if you can figure that one out. We're going to run it across the country. Apparently, when we say across the country, we really mean provinces that are probably in play for Conservatives in the next federal election. So from this story here, despite Smith saying that the campaign was appearing across the country, its material is currently only running in print, radio, and television ads, billboards, bus wraps, and social media in 4 provinces: Alberta, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. The Alberta government says it can't yet provide a breakdown of cost by province for its $8 million to Tell the Feds campaign, but data shows that half of social media ads for what has been described as a national initiative have so far been targeted only at Albertans. So we're only covering 4 provinces with this $8 million ad campaign. And of that $8 million, so far half of it is being targeted to Albertans. It's almost as if this is a national ad campaign that's being used to, I don't know, collect data. I'm speculating purely to get Albertans fired up, to get Albertans angry about the federal government, specifically in provinces that are maybe a little bit more up for play than other provinces. Certainly provinces that maybe Danielle Smith has a vested interest in ensuring get more conservative, especially after the results of the last provincial election, where she eked out a win, but she just eked it out. This is, by many people's interpretation, the provincial government using taxpayers' money to act as a PAC or a TPA for their own interests. And it's a lot of money because you got to remember, we're not just talking about the $8 million for the Tell the Feds campaign. We're also talking about the $7.5 million that's going towards the Alberta pension plan, which, as we'll hear a little bit later, it seems like even Danielle Smith doesn't have a particularly firm grasp about what led us to the place that we're in. But it's very, very clear right now that these marketing campaigns are targeted not to people to change their minds, but to sell them on ideas. And when we look at the fact that we have this $8 million campaign that's going towards Tell the Feds, and we've got the $7.5 million campaign that's going to the Alberta pension plan advertising. Right now, the province of Alberta is dumping $12 million into the province of Alberta in advertising to convince them about political issues that Danielle Smith has already demonstrated she doesn't have a firm grasp on, that the UCP have already demonstrated that they don't have a firm grasp on. So not only is it being used to pitch ideas, it's being used to pitch flawed ideas. But we're going to come back to that a little bit more. Before we get into that, though, we got to talk about the environmental situation in the province of Alberta. Came out just about a week ago. The city of Calgary is looking at more measures to help with drought. Turns out that a lot of the measures that are currently in place for watering are going to be maintained for a little bit while longer. The reality is there's less water available in large parts of the province, and particularly in southern Alberta. Water is becoming a more and more important and more valuable resource. One would think that it would be a time where we would want to do everything that we could to protect the water supply, especially with Danielle Smith and the UCP talking so much about the importance of protecting Albertans. We can't have Albertans overheating in the summer. We can't have Albertans freezing in the dark. But we apparently can allow allow coal mining companies that have already had their projects rejected. We can give them another kick at the can because they changed their name. Now, one of the big things that we got to talk about when we're talking about the coal mining is the fact that the biggest concern that Albertans voiced over and over and over again was the fact that it was going to have a direct impact on the water supply. Not only because the kind of coal mining that they're looking to do uses a lot of water, but also there's more than a little bit of scientific evidence that shows that there will be leaching into the water supply. And it turned into a whole debate as to, well, how much of the toxic stuff is acceptable? The company was called Benga, the Australian mining company. So it's Australian, no less. We're not even making Albertans money directly. We're gonna let the Australians mine the Alberta Rockies because, I guess, reasons. They changed their name. They changed their name to Northback. The statement from the Alberta Energy Regulator reads as follows from the story here. Northback previously submitted a project summary and an environmental impact assessment report, explained Broughton. While the project summary and the EIA was submitted for its previous coal mine applications, Benga Grassy Mountain, that project summary and EIA can be used for any future applications for coal development. Broughton added that if an applicant meets the AAR requirements, including the requirements under the ministerial order, the AAR cannot prohibit a company from filing an application, which turned into this crazy game of ping pong, because a bunch of people said, okay, well, if the AAR is saying that it has to do with the ministerial order, then what's the deal there? How is it that the company who simply changed their name, how did they got rejected, they changed their name, but now they get to use all of the previous work that they did as a separate entity entirely to restart the whole process when there's supposed to be a ministerial order protecting the whole area anyways? How do they get to go through with this? Because when we take a look at the Northback Holdings Corporation, it's very, very clear that they started this process very recently, September 6th. They filed the application. Northback Holdings Corporation, formerly Benga Mining Limited, is requesting for a deep drilling permit associated with a plan to conduct a coal exploration program in the Grassy Mountain deposit located north of Blairmore, Alberta. Well, it turns out that despite the fact that everybody thought the issue was resolved, it's maybe not quite as resolved as everyone thought. People went to Brian Jean, the Minister of Energy, and said, "Hey, Minister of Energy, what's the deal here? Because this seems like a really weird legal loophole. It seems really strange that you'd be able to say, hey, we're not going to allow any coal mining in the in the Grassy Mountain slopes unless you change your name, and then you can use all of the homework from the previous company, and we'll look into it." Now, Brian Jean's explanation was it's actually the AER that defines what an active request is. But as was brought to our attention a little while ago, when the former Minister of Energy, Sonia Savage, wrote the Coal Development Direction, one of the things that was included in that was a clear definition of what an active approval is, with the exception of land subjects to an advanced coal project or an active approval for a coal mine. All approvals for coal exploration or development on Category 3 or 4 lands in the eastern slope shall be suspended, and no new applications will be accepted until such time as written notice is given by the Minister of Energy and Minister of Environment or Parks. So in Section 3, she's saying nobody can do these things anymore. What's an advanced coal project? The proponent has submitted a project summary to the AAR for the purposes of determining whether an environmental impact assessment is required. So it seems pretty clear that just changing the name shouldn't be enough to allow this Australian company to just come in and start ripping apart the Rockies. But for some reason, Brian Jean seems entirely content to just go, oh, well, it's really complicated. It's worth remembering Brian Jean was one of the leadership candidates in the UCP leadership race who campaigned on standing up for Alberta. In fact, every single UCP leadership candidate campaigned on standing up for Alberta. And yet, when it comes to standing up for Alberta's water supply, standing up for Alberta's mountains, for some reason, they're willing to kick the ball back and forth with the AAR instead of just saying, yeah, you know what? We were pretty clear on this. You can't just change your name. It's the same thing as somebody going up to a nightclub and saying, I'd like to get in, with a fake ID, and the doorman saying, yeah, no, that's not going to work. You very clearly don't have a mustache and you're not 50. And the person then coming back with like a little Sharpie-on mustache and saying, no, I swear it's me. It's cool this time, right? It's insulting to the intelligence of Albertans. And it's quite impressive that the entire UCP government doesn't apparently seem to see anything wrong with that. Moving on from there. All through the summer, we heard celebrations from the UCP about, the job situation. We're crushing it on the job situation. So many new jobs. Everybody's moving to Alberta. It's fantastic. Except then September happened. The total levels of employment in Alberta decreased by 38,000 jobs in September. The province of Alberta lost 38,000 jobs. All of those jobs that the province was bragging about creating in July and August, that was 30,000 jobs. So we're down. Even if we want to go, you know what? We crushed it in the summer. We introduced 30,000 new jobs. That's pretty good, isn't it? Even if you want to make that argument, we're still down 8,000 jobs. There's a trend towards part-time work in the province as the number of full-time positions fell by 62,600, while an additional 24,800 people were employed in part-time jobs. So we're hemorrhaging full-time jobs, and people are picking up part-time jobs where they can. Moving on from there, and this is an important story to talk about. It didn't get nearly as much as attention as it should have. It came out of the Tyee, and somebody actually did an analysis on one of the claims that we've heard over and over again from the UCP and the folks who have advocated, well, the folk, because publicly, I guess one could probably argue Rebecca Schultz if you really wanted to, but there's really only been a couple of people who have advocated for the energy moratorium or the renewable energy moratorium. This is the moratorium where Danielle Smith announced for reasons that we still don't know, because everybody that she said asked for it has said, nope, didn't do that. All approvals for renewable energies over 1 megawatt were paused because we had to figure out some big questions. We had to figure out, what are we going to do with all the concrete when the wind turbines have reached their end of life, because the turbines are just dead. I mean, one of the questions that hasn't really come up is, why don't you just mount a new wind turbine on that big chunk of concrete? Because you could do that, right? You don't necessarily have to get rid of the concrete, but we're not going to talk about that right now. Instead, we're going to talk about one of the concerns that has been raised over and over again. This has come up in the rural municipalities. This has come up certainly with Danielle Smith. This has been a talking point that we've heard from lots and lots of people. The farmland, though. We got to take care of the farmland. If we don't take care of the farmland, then we won't have any food. Can you imagine if we have all of this renewable energy and no food? It's just the worst possible outcome that anyone could ever imagine. Except how I'm just going to read from the article here. Of prime farmland area lost, how much did solar projects take? None. There have been no major solar projects that have taken up farmland, that have removed prime farmland from circulation. It's not a thing. And in fact, the one example that Danielle Smith likes to cite is in her home constituency, except it's not her home constituency because she doesn't live there. It was just a really convenient place where she could definitely get a seat after the leadership race. That's Brooks. Oh, she likes to talk about how she drives by the Brooks place and she sees the snow on the solar panels. That can't be good. Well, it turns out snow only decreases solar output by 3%. So I guess there's that. But it just doesn't look nice, is what she says. And it's what her chief puppeteer, chief executive director, Rob Anderson says. It just doesn't look nice. And it uses up all this farmland. Brooks Solar is the only utility scale solar facility, and it sits on industrial land. It doesn't even sit on farmland. So the example that Danielle Smith uses to talk about, hey, the farmland situation, we got to think the farmland, it doesn't matter whether or not the farmers want to use their land for what they want to use their land for. It doesn't matter that there's lots of different ways that solar and farmland can coexist with no difficulties whatsoever. I see this place. I drive by it. It's very, very upsetting. It's on industrial land that wouldn't be used for farmland anyways. So that's a nice little fact to keep in your back pocket the next time somebody says, oh, the farmland. But there's another energy-based story that came up that gets to be really, really important. And this is, there's certain reporters in the province of Alberta that we have just been blessed with. And I know that I say, here at The Breakdown, we're absolutely not journalists. We don't claim to be journalists. But that doesn't mean that we don't have nothing but admiration for the real journalists that are out there. And there's a few that punch way up. It's awesome to see. One of those is somebody who used to be a political reporter. She's now an energy reporter. And she wrote this little story here. Alberta natural gas power plants will continue to operate after 2035 under draft rules. So one of the things that Danielle Smith has said a lot is, we need the natural gas. I don't understand why nobody's building any natural gas. It's so distressing because I just want to sell natural gas. And the people who paid for me to get elected, maybe they really would like to sell some more natural gas. We need natural gas. Why aren't people doing it? And Danielle Smith likes to say, well, it's because the way that the rules are written, nobody wants to invest in natural gas because you won't be allowed to run natural gas. But According to an analysis, various provisions contained in the draft regulations mean that 73 of Alberta's 86 natural-fired gas power plants will still be able to operate in some capacity beyond 2035. Those include allowances for using natural gas when consumer demand is highest and letting plants that have carbon capture technologies produce power. So Danielle Smith's whole thing is we're going to get the carbon capture and then we won't need to decrease production. And the legislation says if you get the carbon capture, you won't need to decrease production. So where's the problem here? Existing plants will also be grandfathered into new regulations with a guaranteed a minimum 20-year lifespan to operate without carbon capture technologies starting as late as 2025, which means that some plants don't even have to have the carbon capture technologies in place. They'll still be able to run to 2045 before they start to run into problems because they don't have carbon capture stuff, which Danielle Smith is betting a whole farm on, in place yet, which is a 5-year difference from Danielle Smith's goal of 2050. Because of the flexibilities we've built in, there is no cliff for natural gas plants, Mr. Guilbeault said in an email. So when we're talking about the natural gas piece, all of the alarm that's being generated by Danielle Smith and the UCP seems to be largely ungrounded, which probably wouldn't happen if they had a functional working knowledge of what the situation actually is. But as we're going to see once we get to our Danielle Smith Says Things segment, we're just going to run one of those every episode, every one of these episodes that we do. We're just going to have a Danielle Smith Says Things segment because the amount of fact checking that we've had to do in the last 2 weeks has been insane. So we're going to put it all in one little place where we can say Danielle Smith uses words, and we'll go about it that way because it's just easier for everybody. We're going to come to that in a little bit, but first we got to talk about the arena deal. We had a big announcement of absolutely nothing's changed, but boy, do we need some positive press in the province, where the arena deal was again re-announced. I guess it was kind of a weird little announcement, where Danielle Smith and the UCP and the city of Calgary and everybody got together and they reiterated what everybody knew about the arena deal. Total project cost is estimated at $1.22 billion. This is a new arena for the Calgary Flames, which the Calgary Stampede will also benefit from hugely. The city of Calgary will contribute $537.3 million, which is 44%. The remaining $686 million, 56%, of the project cost will be covered by the Alberta government, $330 million at 27%. And the Calgary Sports and Entertainment Corporation will be covering $356 million at 29%. For those of you who are doing math at home, that means taxpayers are paying 71% of the $1.22 billion to get this multi-billion-dollar corporation some new digs. Now, this has been a highly controversial issue because of the amount of taxpayers' money that's going towards this whole endeavor. And you'd think that most of the questions at the press conference would have to do with, hey, so why are taxpayers spending all of this money for an arena? And the answers that you'll get back from the politicians will be, well, we got a 30-year commitment for the Flames to stay, so that's nice too. And there will be jobs created. There's 1,500 jobs that we estimate that will be created from full permanent jobs that will be created from this. So that's good too when we're hemorrhaging 38,000 jobs in a month. So, that's a drop in a proverbial bucket. But there were other questions that came up in the course of the press conference that had nothing to do with the arena deal, because this was a press conference where people could ask Danielle Smith questions, and she's kind of slippery these days. Wanted to take a second to talk about some of those questions. The first one had to do with the announcement that a certain province to the east maybe is going to be invoking the notwithstanding clause so that they can not protect LGBTQ2S plus youth. Here's the question.
Premier Moe next door in Saskatchewan has said he's going to use the notwithstanding clause to essentially support provincial legislation that says similar things to this separate school board policy. I'm just curious for the Premier, what do you think about Premier Mo's decision to do that, and would you support similar legislation provincially if it was supported by the grassroots of your party?
As I said, we haven't made a decision as a caucus. We're still watching to see what policies are in place in other parts of the country. I do think, though, that we have to understand that children can't be in a position where they're forced to have two identities, one at home and one at school. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to find an avenue where we can support a child as they're making these decisions. Because I think if we're concerned about the mental health and wellness of a child, making sure that they're not being torn in two directions has got to be the direction that we support as a government. I'll wait and see how the legal process plays out in Saskatchewan, but at the moment we haven't made any decisions to legislate here.
Now, it's a pretty tepid response, but it seems to, if you want to interpret it in its most generous, and let's be clear, it is absolutely interpreting it in its most generous interpretation, it sounds like what she's saying is kids shouldn't be forced to have two identities. They shouldn't be forced to live a double life. Now, if you interpret that from the assumption that she believes, as she said in the past, that she's an ally, then what she seems to be saying is that kids shouldn't have to be forced to pretend to be something they're not at home and at school. The problem that you're going to run into, though, is that when we're talking about who's being forced to live a double life, it's the home part that's the problem. Because as we've talked about many times on the show, the ugly reality is that there are parents who will kick their kids out if their kids are comfortable or dare to show them who they really are. The statistics bear this out. Trans youth are incredibly susceptible to being abused and being kicked out of their homes because of who they are. The whole point of schools being willing to acknowledge and use a different name or a different pronoun than what that kid showed up with originally is that school is creating a space where that kid can be who that kid is. And it's a pretty uncommon thing that a kid asks for that. But the reality is, if we're going to talk about which of those two environments is going to allow that kid to be who they are, if there's a toxic situation, that toxic situation, up until very recently, would have been in the home. But, as we also heard in this press conference, it's not just parents who are refusing to let these kids be who they are. Here's the question that Smith was also asked.
Catholic School District has a policy on the books this fall for the first time that requires school staff to call students by the names and the pronouns that their parents prefer, even when a student disagrees. So the Premier, this is for the Premier, you've described yourself as an LGBTQ ally. Wondering if you agree with this policy, and if the Mayor would like to weigh in on whether she agrees, that'd be great.
Well, I always approach these issues by looking at it through the perspective of the child. And we've been having discussions in our caucus and discussions across, watching what's happening across the country. And I would say from the perspective of the health of the child, it's important that all the adults in their life support them. And we would love to get to a point where everybody is included in a decision that a child makes. We are watching with interest to see how that unfolds. We don't have policy established on it yet, but we are having those discussions. These are really very complicated family matters, very personal decisions, and it's been my hope from the beginning that we wouldn't politicize this. I think that we have to always be mindful as we have these conversations that there are young people who are really struggling with gender identity, they're struggling with puberty, struggling with how they fit in, and I think it's incumbent upon us as adults to make sure that we keep a safe, supportive environment for kids. So that's what we've been trying to do, trying to be very cautious that we maintain that kind of environment here, and we're watching it with great interest.
Now, let's just be clear. The question that was asked is, do you support the policy by the Calgary Catholic School Division? It's a yes or no question. It wasn't, do you and the United Conservative Party support this policy? Do you and 15 people that you know support this policy? It was, do you support this policy? It's a yes or no question. And it's actually really easy to answer, because if someone was to ask me if I support the policy, the answer is no. Brief, short, concise. It's not that hard. Now, I know that there's lots of people out there who very clearly support the policy, because otherwise it wouldn't be a policy. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change the fact that the reason why kids don't talk to their parents about their sexual orientation or their gender identity is because their parents have failed to create an environment where the kid feels safe doing that, period. It's hard to hear. I've said this many times on the show before. That's a hard pill to swallow. But if your kid doesn't feel comfortable, if they don't feel safe talking to you about those sorts of things because they're afraid that you're going to be disappointed in them, or they're afraid that you're going to kick them out, or they're afraid that you're going to try to beat the gay out of them, that's on the parents, period. And to say to a kid who's trying to navigate a home life like that, and I'm not saying, to be clear, I'm not saying all parents are like that, because they're not. The vast majority of parents aren't. But the truth is, there's some. That's why we have things like Child and Family Protective Services, because there's some people out there who treat their kids like absolute garbage, and it shouldn't happen. And this is the Calgary Catholic School Board stating, you know what? We just don't want to have anything to do with this fight. We don't want to have to deal with the drama. We're going to force this kid to pretend to be something other than what they are, because we just don't want to deal with the angry parents. This policy from the Calgary Catholic School Board, just to be clear, is cowardice. Period. And you would hope that some of the other politicians who are maybe posed that question would be able to answer with the same brevity or the same directness. But even the mayor of Calgary had to position her words very carefully.
So although I'm not able to make decisions on behalf of students, I'm not part of the school board, I'm a municipally elected official, so I really don't have the ability to weigh in on the policy making, but I am also a human being that has a lot of compassion for other human beings. I'm a parent. There are many things that my child and I talk about. There are many things that don't get disclosed to me because they're kids. And sometimes they need to be kids. And all of us that grew up in the 60s and 70s, we would leave the house in the morning. We'd come back when someone screamed at us to get home from dinner, to get home to dinner. There were many things we didn't tell our parents. They weren't nefarious things. They were things that let us be kids. So I would just like to say to all the adults in the room, let your kids be themselves, their complete selves. And to the policymakers, make sure you're thinking about the people that you're making these policies for, and you're looking out for the mental health and well-being of children while you're doing it.
She's not wrong. I don't disagree with anything she said there, but she didn't condemn the policy. I don't understand why it's so hard for people who are in positions of leadership and positions of authority and positions of power to just say, no, I don't agree with this. Why is that so difficult? She could have said everything she said there, and before she walked away from the microphone, she could have said, so no, I don't agree with this policy. I don't think that the people who are making these policies are looking out for the best interest of these kids. I'm concerned, if you want to hedge it a little bit, I'm concerned that the people who are making these policies are maybe more concerned about the ire of the parents than they are the best interest of these kids, and I don't agree with this policy. But again, we didn't get that. It shouldn't be so hard to just say, no, I don't agree with this policy. I'm worried it's going to hurt kids. Especially if you're not a member of that organization and you're standing on the outside. What have you got to lose? Particularly given the climate that we're seeing being introduced as we head into the UCP, AGM, and policy convention. Because we've got some policies we got to talk about, folks. It's a bit of a shit show out there, not gonna lie. Now, this isn't the first time that we've talked about the UCP policy proposals. A couple of weeks back, we talked about the fact that the UCP were ranking the policies that they believed were the most pressing, the most important, that needed to be addressed at the UCP AGM. These are the policies that the party should stand up for and commit to and stuff, because they're important. And a lot of people looked at a lot of the policies that were on there and went, wow, that's a lot of crazy. That's a lot of conspiracy theories. That's a lot of not actually happening. Why are those policies in there? Is this who the UCP is now? And the response from a lot of people, particularly members of the UCP, was like, these are just the proposals. We're just ranking the proposals. It's not that bad. It's not like these policies are actually getting into convention. Well, yes, they are. And yes, they are, in fact, just that bad. We're going to run through some of them. Now, we have it's public. It's a public document now. You can go to the UCP website and pull the document off. You can also pull it off of our X. I miss Twitter. We've got the link up on a thread where we threw up a bunch of the policies that we're going to highlight tonight as well. But there are some that certainly speak to the fact that the UCP is definitely going all the way down a few of the rabbit holes. And the problem that you have as you go farther and farther down the rabbit holes is it gets a whole lot darker. The first policy that we're going to look at here is the policy proposal 19. And this is where they're straight up saying, well, public education, do we really need it? Because they're straight up saying that they want to implement a school voucher system to ensure that education follows each student and enhances the vision of school choice. The school voucher should include the following fund sources calculated on a per student, school, and district basis: per student, basic education grant, specialized learning amounts, rural supplemental transportation grants, yada, 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 yada. So they want to tie all of the funding that any particular school gets to a particular student. And then if that student wants to go to a private school, then they should absolutely just be allowed to do that. And the problem with that is a lot of kids can't afford to go to the super expensive private schools. But this is where we start to really just lean all the way into the conspiracy theories. They have a policy that the government of Alberta should protect Albertans' rights to have access to goods and services using cash, and the option to bank with provincially regulated institutions that supply cash instead of digital currency. We don't like Interact in Alberta, apparently, which is that's quite something. But that's just, again, that's the start, because you have to know that the 15-minute cities made it in there as well. The United Conservative Party believes that the government of Alberta should prohibit any land use or development planning initiatives that would restrict freedom of residence as per Section 6 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We should be able to walk where we want, drive where we want. If we want to drive on somebody's front lawn, we should be able to do that. We want a 4x4 across a city park, we should be able to do that. The rationale: there's much debate over the implementation of design strategies in urban areas, which are known as 15-minute cities. Planners defend their usage, stating their aim is to make cities more livable by ensuring that all essential services, think schools, medical care, and shops, are within the distance of a short walk or bicycle ride. Broadly, the ideal is to cut down on long commutes and car emissions and improve people's quality of lives by ensuring they have access to quality services where they live, which are all benign and noble goals. However, in the United Kingdom, because that's Canada, where the city of Oxford has begun implementing these designs, Oxfordshire County Council has recently passed a bylaw that will prevent excess movement between zones. So what Oxford County Council is doing is they're saying, we're going to implement some toll roads. If you want to drive on these roads, it's going to cost you more to do it because we're trying to decrease the amount of traffic, just like any other toll road in the country, which we do have and have consistently had across the country. But because of 15-minute cities, this is now a policy that is actually going forward to be debated at the UCP AGM. But we're jumping right to the points of some of the questions that Smith got, because Policy Proposal 8, the United Conservative Party believes the government of Alberta should require teachers, schools, and school boards to obtain the written consent of the parent guardian of a student under the age of 16 prior to changing the name and/or pronouns used by the student. And it directly references Saskatchewan and New Brunswick. This is why it's so important that people like Danielle Smith answer the damn question, because the call is coming from inside the House. Not only that, Policy Proposal 29, the United Conservative Party believes the government of Alberta should protect inmates who are female at conception. So we're now going all the way to conception to determine gender as a binary construct, which all scientific evidence says it's not. And are housed at correctional remand centers for women operated by Alberta's Correctional Services by refusing to house any inmate who is male at conception at said correctional and remand centers. The evidence, it has become clear. If it wasn't so horrifying, if it wasn't so offensive, if it didn't consider the fact at all that what this proposal is saying is, if you are a trans person who is female presenting, if you weren't that at conception, we're either going to send you to a men's prison where you're going to be a huge target, or maybe we'll make some special trans prisons too. Not only does this whole policy seem to not understand how the justice system works, how the different correction systems work, but it's a straight up anti-trans dog whistle. And again, these are policies that are going to be debated. These made it through. There are, of course, the COVID greatest hits as well. The United Conservative Party believes the government of Alberta should protect an individual's right to informed consent regarding decisions their own body, and then it leans right into vaccination. The United Conservative Party believes the government of Alberta should protect an individual's right to privacy and confidentiality of their healthcare information. We're talking about the vaccine passports. The United Conservative Party believes the government of Alberta should enshrine the doctor-patient relationship by protecting Alberta physicians from undue third-party interference. We don't like those College of Physicians. We don't like that evidence-based medicine being required. To neither compel physicians to prescribe treatments nor prohibit them from prescribing treatments, and to include the right of physicians to prescribe off-label medications using their best discretion with the informed consent of the patient. Now, we've talked about this before on the show, where the idea of informed consent is aspirational at best most of the time. Physicians absolutely do their best to try to provide the best information that's available for all procedures. But the notion that somebody is going to be able to understand how a given drug affects the coagulation cascade when they don't even know what the coagulation cascade is ridiculous. There are people who take medications to prevent clotting. Those medications are colloquially referred to as blood thinners, despite the fact that none of them actually thin the blood. They just change how the different ingredients of blood interact with each other. So it gets really complex, really, really quick. But the dangerous notion is there are some garbage physicians out there. I'm not denigrating physicians. I want to be really clear about that, because there are some amazing physicians, and we are lucky to have the physicians that we still do in this province, because Lord knows there's a bit of a shortage going on. But in any profession, there are always going to be the ones that you're like, oh, yeah, Gary. I don't know about Gary, man. Like, he seems to, boy, it sure is a good thing that we have all of these safeguards in place to prevent Gary from trying to convince his patients that they should do batshit crazy treatments. It sure is a good thing that those safeguards exist. It sure is a good thing that Gary knows if he decides to go experimenting on his patients and convincing them that these are the best possible treatments, like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, for things that those medications have absolutely no evidence for, it sure is a good thing that Gary will be held responsible. And we saw this with Danielle Smith's lawsuit, where she was trying to get physicians to come forward to say, well, you know, you could give it a try, I guess. And none of those physicians wanted to do it because they knew they would be going against the best available evidence. And if we stop practicing medicine with evidence, then we're just going back to making shit up and using leeches. This is what that policy is advocating for. But there's even more that we got to touch on. There's three more we're going to touch on. But again, for anybody who's concerned about these, I would strongly encourage you to go to the UCP website and read through them all, because this is what the membership voted on. This is the temperature of the membership of the UCP right now. Policy Proposal 15. This one I just... I just wish we could stop. The United Conservative Party believes the government of Alberta should recognize that Albertans have many endangered, God-given rights and freedoms that are not formally affirmed in the Canadian Constitution, its enactments, or Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So we're not talking about enumerated rights. We're talking about these are rights that God told me I have. What are we talking about? Expanding existing fundamental freedoms, conscience, religion, thought, belief, opinion, and expression, freedom of the press, peaceful expanded assembly and association. We should add the following rights. The right to bear arms. Tell me that you wish you were American without telling me that you wish you were American. Parents' rights. Right to self-defense. What's interesting about this is this policy actually acknowledges formally with the UCP that there is no such thing as parents' rights under the Charter. Glad we got that one out of the way. Rights to self-defense, and it goes on. It basically goes through, hey, if we were going through the American system, what are all the rights that the Americans would have? Because that's working out super well for their gun deaths. Policy Proposal 13. They want to get rid of all electronic voting machines for tabulation or voting because it's just conspiracy theory time. Policy Proposal 20. The United Conservative Party believes that the government of Alberta should ensure that teachers, school boards, and third parties provide services to kindergarten to grade 12 schools do not provide access to materials of a sexual, racist, or abusive nature, including but not limited to books, handouts, online materials, live events that are not part of the Alberta Program of Studies. So if we're going to get rid of any materials that talk about anything sexual, anything racist, anything abusive, then you can just throw the entire history of this country out the window. You can throw the entire history of this province out the window. We're not even going to try to educate kids about things like consent or history or the mistakes of history or anything like that. We're just going to give them the good things so that we'll just pretend that the bad things don't exist. But here's the problem with that. This comes from a particularly religious bent. You don't see a whole lot of atheists saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't be talking about this stuff. Maybe we should be getting rid of all of the books that have anything to do with anything sexual or racist or abusive. We should get all of those materials out of the school system. So there's no question that there's a little bit of a religious bent. But the only question that I have for anybody who's advocating for this policy that comes from any kind of a religious background is, are you okay with the Bible being the first book that gets removed? Because unless you haven't cracked the pages of that book, it is full of racism, it is full of violence, and it is full of sexual content. So all of a sudden now, any of our religious texts can't be in the schools. Instead of teaching kids how to navigate these materials, how to view them through the lens of history, how to interpret them for the times in which they were created, we're just going to remove them all and pretend they don't exist. This has to be one of the dumbest policies that comes out of this whole shit show of a policy proposal. The last one, with the Alberta model, seeing deaths increasing because of drug toxicity. Policy Proposal 22 is very simple. The United Conservative Party believes the government of Alberta should end provincial funding for supervised consumption sites, which leaves only two options. Privatized supervised consumption sites, that'll go well, or getting rid of supervised consumption sites, period. And it's important to remember, supervised consumption sites save lives. They buy people time. They build relationships. The diversion rates out of supervised consumption sites to treatment are incredible. There are so many successes to be celebrated. It's not just, look, we're going to let all these people use all these drugs. But the culture that exists in the UCP right now apparently believes that this is a policy that should be debated. Last policy that we want to talk about, for absolutely no particular reason whatsoever. It's just fascinating that conservatives apparently believe this. I don't know why. But the United Conservative Party believes the government of Alberta should require all regulatory professional associations and trade organizations to limit investigations of their members for complaints regarding professional conduct of their members to instances of activities that occur while on the job, and limit the application of any code of conduct to professional activities and exclude personal affairs. I don't know why I wanted to read that policy online tonight. I just really, really did. Moving on from there. We got a couple other big things that we got to talk about. Like I said, it's going to be a long one tonight because we got a lot to catch up on. But one of the biggest stories that came out this week had to do with the Supreme Court ruling about the Impact Assessment Act. Now, this is Bill C-69, and there is a lot to unpack here because this is something that has been misrepresented and misrepresented and misrepresented and then misrepresented a little bit more. And then just when you thought it was going to be finished being misrepresented, no, we can still definitely misrepresent it a little bit more. So what we're talking about when we're talking about Bill C-69, we got to know exactly what it is to start with. What does Bill C-69 do? And in effect, the part that gets to be talked about with the Supreme Court, and we got a couple of requests in with a couple of legal scholars and experts to really sort of make sure that we're unpacking this appropriately and completely. But we're going to try to do the basics tonight because there's a lot of confusion on it. So what is the question around Bill C-69? Well, what Bill C-69, or the Environmental Assessment Act, was supposed to do was to address what needs to be looked at for any major project that's going to happen in Canada. What are the things that should be considered? And one of the things that you need to know before you determine what are the things that need to be considered is what would even qualify for projects that we would need to include as part of this legislation. This is where the Supreme Court really came in. Because what the idea behind C-69 was, it was supposed to ensure that any proposed projects had to consider the health, social, and economic effects, including with respect to the intersection of sex and gender with other identity factors. So this was where a lot of people are like, oh, you're going to do the gender of a pipeline. And no, that's not what it is. What it was talking about is with certain projects, you definitely do see an increase in things like substance use, in things like sex trafficking. So that should be part of the overall consideration when we're talking about major projects. It has nothing to do with whether or not a pipeline has a gender. That's just juvenile. But that's what the act was supposed to do. Where the Supreme Court has issued an opinion is that they say that some of the projects that the federal government said are going to be under their jurisdiction with this act maybe shouldn't be things that are included under their jurisdiction. Perhaps they're overreaching. And the Supreme Court actually said in certain areas they are, in fact, overreaching. Now, the Supreme Court said to the federal government, there are parts of this legislation that are not constitutional. The federal government has said the act remains in force. We're just going to make some tweaks. Danielle Smith had some fascinating words that she decided to use in regards to the thing. One of the things that Danielle Smith said, you know what, we're just going to jump right to it. One of the things that Danielle Smith and a few other people have talked about is tech mine. So tech mine was a big project a couple years ago that dragged on for years and years and years, and it was eventually canceled. And of course, the conservatives, the UCP, Jason Kenney, immediately, oh, we got something we can try to blame on the feds. So they, using the vernacular of calling this the No New Pipelines Act, because that's not actually what it was. It's just what Kenney and co. decided to call it. They said, oh, this is the federal government. This is why tech failed. Now, tech was very clear. They didn't see the return on investment. But even if you don't want to believe that, it's important to remember, and this has been pointed out on social media in a bunch of different places from legitimate legal scholars. In July 2012, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012 came into force and repealed the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Pursuant to Section 126 of the CEAA 2012, the review of the Frontier Project commenced under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act and continued under the CEAA. So when we're talking about tech, it wasn't assessed under the Justin Trudeau No New Pipelines Act. It was assessed under the previous act. So even if you want to say it was because of the legislation the tech backed out, even though the tech has been very clear that's not why they backed out, it wasn't even assessed under the legislation that we're talking about with the Supreme Court. But that didn't stop Danielle Smith and a bunch of other pundits from saying, oh, you know what? It's this No New Pipelines Act. And this is part of the problem with the way that the conversation happens. We get politicians who decide that they want to come up with a name for something that's catchy and will get people upset. And so they come up with something like the No New Pipelines Act, no new major projects. We're just going to stop all development. And they talk about it that way because it gets people angry. It gets people to vote for them. It gets people to give them money. But as we saw with Danielle Smith, it also has a tendency of getting people to buy their own bullshit. So let's take a look at this week's segment. It's going to be a regular thing. Stuff Danielle Smith said.
The UCP releasing their resolution for the AGM coming up in November. One of those policies includes obtaining the written consent of parents and guardians for changing the name or pronouns used by a student in school. Is the province prepared to use the notwithstanding clause to make this a law at all?
Look, I support the grassroots process that our members are going through at the party. I'm really excited that we've got, I think now 2,100 or more delegates, so it's going to be a robust discussion. We'll watch that. And the policy process is one of the measures that our cabinet and caucus use in making a decision. But we also confer with stakeholders, and we also talk to Albertans. And so I want to see how the debate goes, and then we'll make some decisions once we see whether or not it passes.
Now, it's pretty interesting. That's the question in regards to the Notwithstanding Act being used for pronouns. It's pretty interesting how much Danielle Smith's response evolved. But, of course, we are going to get back into the C-69 and the Sovereignty Act stuff right quick here. So let's talk about the Sovereignty Act. Danielle Smith appeared on a podcast just a few days ago, where she was asked, hey, how does the Sovereignty Act work? How do you view it in regards to the Constitution? And her answer was remarkable.
Talk about under what conditions the Sovereignty Act would be triggered. And actually, I think some people wonder, well, how much weight does it really carry in our Confederation? I
mean, in some ways, I look at it as a notwithstanding clause on federal legislation that interferes in our jurisdiction. That's sort of how I look at it. Because people have asked me over the years, why can't we use the notwithstanding clause against that piece of federal legislation? And that's what we're going to try to do. If they come through with a policy that is clearly outside the bounds, and I think I gave examples of 5 or 6 that I think are, then we're going to have to put up a wall and say, no, we're just not going to enact that legislation. We're going to create defensive measures, and it'll be ended up being fought out in the court, I suspect. But I'm prepared to go to court and say, we're defending the Constitution. We're defending our right to develop our resources. We're defending our constitutional right to develop our own electricity system. We're aligned with the federal objective of carbon neutrality by 2050. We're asserting our right to be able to manage our emissions environment. We're asserting that we have an obligation to provide reliable energy, affordable energy, and make sure that the power grid doesn't go out in the middle of winter or in the heat of summer. And I have to believe that the Supreme Court will say, you know what? You are making your best effort to achieve that outcome. You're aligned with the federal government, not acting in opposition, and we recognize your jurisdiction. But that's the conversation that we need to have.
So there's a lot to unpack in that clip. First of all, Danielle Smith says, we're willing to go to court. That's why we need the Sovereignty Act. If you want to look at the Supreme Court decision, you can only look at the Supreme Court decision as the courts being objective, the courts being fair, and the system that we've set up to ensure that the Constitution, jurisdictions, are protected and dealt with appropriately, worked. The system worked. The federal government put forward some legislation that was an overreach. It went to court. The Supreme Court said, yeah, you're overreaching a little bit there. You better fix that. And now the federal government's responsibility is to fix it. All of this happened without having to have a Sovereignty Act. Danielle Smith said she's willing to go to court, but she didn't answer the question as to why she believes she needs the Sovereignty Act. She says she's willing to take any of these issues all the way to the Supreme Court, but none of them require the Sovereignty Act. So again, she hasn't answered the question. She doesn't even seem to understand herself why it is that she needs the Sovereignty Act, because the Supreme Court very clearly will settle up the questions as to who has jurisdiction over what, where does that overlap. But even then, even when the court explicitly spells it out, even when the court explicitly says, this is how the jurisdiction works, and there's not particular pieces that are exclusive, even when the court goes out of their way to release a plain language version of their ruling, this is what happens.
Pointed out, and you've argued here, that this ruling essentially sets up these projects as being exclusively under provincial jurisdiction. But in the decision, the Chief Justice said very explicitly, and I'm going to quote here, she said, the fact that a project involves activities primarily regulated by the provincial legislatures does not create an enclave of exclusivity, end quote. In other words, while he said you wrote that the legislation was overbroad, the ruling doesn't give immunity to the province from federal law. Can you respond to that?
Well, look, I mean, I have responded to that with our 2050 target to get to carbon neutral. That's my acknowledgement that the federal government does have a right to set an overarching framework for the entire country as we try to reduce emissions. I'm being very proactive. I'm being very collaborative. They're the ones who are going too far. And I guess if we can keep on battling this out in the Supreme Court to find out exactly where the line is, but I'm asking for the federal government to accept that there is exclusive provincial jurisdiction under the Constitution, accept that that's what the language of the Constitution says, and to work with us on those areas of shared priority. They cannot just drop new policy on our head and make us spend another 6 years going through the court to be told once again that they've been acting illegally. So that's what I hope does not happen. I think that it's pretty clear what the court has said. They want to see us work collaboratively, and that is not acting in the way that Stephen Guilbeault has been. So if there's a new spirit of coming together in cooperation to align our goals around a 2050 emissions target, then I think we'll be able to get somewhere. But if they think that they're going to tinker with this and keep us tied up for the next 6 years, well, I can tell you, we're just not going to put up with that.
She's literally read a quote from the Supreme Court saying this does not create an enclave of exclusivity. And Danielle Smith's response is to immediately turn around and go, la, 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 with her fingers in her ears and say, I reject your reality and I substitute my own that's preferential. She says she accepts the principle that the court will make rulings on this, and she's willing to listen to the Supreme Court, except when the Supreme Court doesn't say what she likes. They don't say the things that she likes. Then she'll just say, I don't believe that. She says she accepts the principle that they're supposed to be working together, but she'll only accept that principle as long as she gets to define all of the terms under how they work together. It's absolutely wild that in the space of 2 minutes, she can go from literally hearing a quote from the Supreme Court in the ruling that she's there to talk about and say, I just don't, I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that. It's really, really quite impressive. But Smith has said, C-69, that's the worst. In that same press conference, she said, projects have been canceled because of this federal legislation. And you would think somebody with a history of public speaking, as long as Smith's is, there's certain rules that you have when you're doing public speaking. One of them is you never ask a question that you don't know the answer to yourself. One of them is if you're going to make a statement, you have to be able to back that up. But Smith was asked, hey, you keep saying that Alberta's lost out on all these projects because of Bill C-69. Got any receipts? And the train wreck that followed is absolutely wild.
You mentioned today that you suggested the legislation is already responsible for the loss of tens of billions of dollars in investment. And you brought up the Tech Frontier Mine, which is an interesting example to me. Are you aware of any project that has been explicitly stymied or held up or canceled because of impact assessments under this legislation rather than just simple economic considerations?
Well, of course, it's only been a couple of hours since we got the ruling down, so we can follow up with you on identifying projects. There have been many companies who've said that because they don't know if they can navigate through the regulatory process, that they've pulled the plug. I mean, that was the story that Energy East told us. They'd spent, I think, $10 billion on the project and couldn't see a way through to get to maybe $1 billion on the project, couldn't see a way through to get to the finish line. That's what happens when you have regulatory uncertainty. That's what happens when you just don't know if you're going to be able to get to a yes. And so I'll be happy to get our officials to follow up with you on projects that we think ended up either not going forward or got pulled because they couldn't figure out where the decision-making authority lay.
Thank you.
But I can tell you this. We have almost zero projects in the queue for natural gas. And that, to me, is a direct result of the federal government interfering in our market and creating uncertainty about whether or not such projects would be able to go ahead. Under normal circumstances, we're a natural gas basin. We've got 12,000 megawatts of natural gas on our grid. Why in the world would I only have 41,000 megawatts of solar and wind in the queue and virtually no natural gas? That is absolutely underscoring why nobody wants to invest in natural gas in our province. That is 100% because of the uncertainty that the federal government created from this act. So how many of those how many projects would be there if they hadn't created that uncertainty? I don't know if I can calculate that, but I know it would be a heck of a lot more than zero that we have right now.
And there's another prime example of Danielle Smith doing an incredible job of speaking well, but not saying anything of substance or importance, because she was directly presented with, hey, tech mine, that's a fascinating correlation because it had nothing to do with this legislation. Do you have any examples of how this legislation canceled projects or how companies walked away from projects? That has absolutely nothing to do with the ruling, to be clear. If a company said 6 months ago, hey, you know what? This Bill C-69 thing, I just can't even with it. I'm not gonna invest because Bill C-69. The ruling doesn't change that. The only thing that the ruling changes is whether or not the feds have to go back and retool the legislation. If there were examples, there should be examples. But Danielle Smith wasn't able to provide any examples because they don't exist. But then she goes on her whole tirade about the regulatory uncertainty hampering investment. And if it's remarkable to me that the example that she chooses to go with is we don't have any major projects for natural gas. We've got 41,000 megawatts of solar and wind, but we can't get any projects for natural gas because of regulatory uncertainty. And yet she just finished putting a 7-month moratorium on the one area that she's got investment for energy production. It's absolutely wild. But she wasn't able to produce any examples. She wasn't able to produce any legitimate places where projects were canceled because of Bill C-69. Which should tell you something. Because when politicians spend from the inception of the bill to the Supreme Court ruling we're talking about years. Literally years, about the damage that this bill is going to bring. You'd think that they'd be able to find 1 or 2 examples where a company has said, because of Bill C-69, we're not going to do it. Especially when you've been involved in advocacy and lobbying, as Danielle Smith was for years before she became the leader of the United Conservative Party. But this is only heated up because Calgary MP George Chahal has been firing shots back and forth with Danielle Smith. And she got asked about it. And this yesterday was your province, your premier. And oh boy, we got so very much to talk about there. But one of the things that came up in this war of words had to do with Danielle Smith and her recent experience, let's say, with the question as to whether or not the new regulations that the feds are putting forward to get the energy grid to net zero by 2035 and have the whole country net zero by 2050. Danielle Smith has made some claims about what will happen to those CEOs if their companies aren't net zero.
Paul says your government's Tell the Feds ad campaign amounts to, quote, politically motivated misinformation, unquote. Now, Chahal says Ottawa's clean energy regulations do provide for some flexibilities that would allow Alberta to continue with natural gas power regulation past 2035. Are those flexibilities there?
No, they're not there. And let me tell you 2 reasons why. Because what they're saying is that by 2035, natural gas has to have emissions abatement technology that will abate 95% of emissions. Current technology allows us to abate 65% of emissions, which is pretty good. The industry thinks we might get to 80%, which is pretty darn good. But if you are not at 95% by 2035, their provision allows for the government to start arresting the heads of companies who aren't at that level of emissions. That is not flexibility.
Chahal said there's no way that's going to happen, that's not there.
Oh, come on. It's on their website. It talks about criminal law powers. It talks about imprisonment. It talks about fines. So they can't say trust us because, quite frankly, I don't trust them because they behaved illegally for the past 6 years, interfering in our jurisdiction. And it took us fighting at the Supreme Court level for 6 years before they were called out on it. We're just not going to let that happen. No. The second part is that in our environment, when we have solar and wind that comes on stream in an intermittent way, we always have to have a backup. And our backup is natural gas peaker plants. They want those plants to be limited to only be allowed to operate 450 hours a year. I talk to folks who operate these plants. They say a minimum of 2,000 hours is necessary. So we can't be in a situation where we get to 450 hours of usage by January 3rd, the third week of January, and they have to turn it off because then we'll end up with blackouts. Or in the summer, if they've already used up their allocation because of winter and we end up with 30 degrees, and they're not able to offset if the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, or if the wind isn't blowing for air conditioning and they have to shut that off. When you have minus 30 and plus 30 weather and you can't turn on your furnace and you can't turn on your air conditioning, people die. People die of heat stroke all the time, and the number of deaths that happen in winter as a result of supreme cold are also high. We can't allow that to happen. We won't allow that to happen. So, with due respect to George Chahal, he doesn't understand electricity. He doesn't understand our market, and that is precisely the reason why the federal government should not be regulating in this area. I've been studying it since 1999, so I will put my knowledge up on this up against George Chahal any day of the week.
Danielle Smith's been studying it since 1999, and yet she can't think of a single project that was canceled because of C69. Okay, that's wild. But let's take a look. There's so much, again, with anything Smith, there's so much to unpack in that clip, because she keeps talking about the interference and the illegal maneuvers that the feds have done. And while there's no question that the Supreme Court has ruled that there are elements of C69 that are unconstitutional, that doesn't mean that it was illegal. It means that there was a court case that was going on to determine whether or not it was illegal. But even if you go down the road of saying that there are elements of C69 that are unconstitutional, which has been proven in court, even if, with that acceptance, doesn't change the fact that we can't put a finger on any projects that have been canceled because of C69. Now, it's impressive that Danielle Smith was able to catch herself, because she stopped shy of saying that the sun doesn't shine in summer in Alberta. Alberta is actually one of the best places in the world for solar energy because of how much the sun shines in summer. But there's some other things that, again, she doesn't really seem to think about the long-term implications of what it is that she's arguing. She says, people die all the time of heat stroke. People die all the time from the supreme cold. People die. This happens. We're not gonna let it get worse. So your argument is, Danielle, that the UCP, who have been in government for 5 years, have done such a terrible job of managing the situation that there are high numbers of people dying from heat stroke and from supreme cold. Now, if we were talking about the homeless and houseless populations, you might have an argument there. But if you're going to say that it's the electricity grid that's failing, then it's not being accessed by the homeless and the houseless folks, because they're dying because they don't have access to it. So who exactly is it that the UCP is letting die already? To say nothing of the fact that when we're talking about how most people heat their homes in the province of Alberta, it doesn't have very much to do with the power grid. It has to do overwhelmingly with natural gas. But again, this is Danielle Smith doing the thing. She's talking. She's using the words. She's sounding very, very convincing. Now, you would think that if Danielle had previously been told, if it had been previously demonstrated that the criminal penalties that would potentially be pursued if somebody was in flagrant violation of these laws when they come into effect, ignoring the fact that, as we talked about earlier, the Globe and Mail very clearly spelled out that existing plants will be grandfathered into the new regulations with a guaranteed a minimum 20-year lifespan to operate without carbon capture technologies starting as late as 2025. So that puts us at 2045, not 2035. So there's so many questions and so much inconsistency. Even if we ignore all of that, if Danielle had a public moment, I don't know, recently maybe, where it was demonstrated that her claim that CEOs would be put in jail was false, maybe she wouldn't repeat that talking point. Maybe she would learn from it.
Who
Maybe
wants to
not.
bring on new power looking at natural gas. It'll have to be 100% almost abated by 2035. Otherwise, people will end up going to jail. And we just want people to understand it's not realistic, not achievable, not constitutional, and it will not result in reliability and affordability. Everyone needs to be concerned about this.
What do you mean people will go to jail if the electricity grid isn't clean by 2035? You think the federal government's going to slap handcuffs on your energy operators?
Yeah, that's what they've said. They've said that it's a criminal code violation in 2035 if you have unabated natural gas and you haven't been able to abate 95% of your emissions. The problem is the technology isn't available to be able to have that level of sequestration yet. And so company CEOs are now making the decision, do we invest today knowing that in January of 2035, our CEO is going to be imprisoned? For 3 years is the actual terms, because they're using their criminal law power to try to invade our provincial jurisdiction and our right to be able to create our own electricity grid. It's serious. And that's why we have seen that there is a lot of hesitation to invest in baseload power. And we need to make sure people understand the consequences of that.
Okay. I appreciate the challenge, and we'll reach out to the federal government to ask them about your concerns about incarceration over emissions.
And they did. And the federal government said, that's not going to happen. And they aired that immediately after Smith finished her interview. One would think if there was a competent comms advisor in the room, they would have said, hey, Danielle, the entirety of Canada who watches CBC just got told that talking point is false. One would think if there was a competent comms person in the room, a competent political strategist, they would have said, maybe don't use that line. But that's the line that she keeps going back to, despite the fact that there's no evidence for it. It's almost as if once a talking point gets into Danielle Smith's head, she's not able to pry it out of there. And she'll keep going back to it, no matter how true or false it actually is. Which brings us up to the next thing that Danielle Smith said. Because that's our whole segment now. We're just doing things Danielle Smith said. Danielle Smith tweeted out on the 12th. On Tuesday, I accepted on behalf of the government of Alberta an invitation to appear. I just noticed there's two appears in that. It's funny when you read things out loud. That's one of the proofreading things that a lot of people actually do. At the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development today, they sent a letter rejecting my attendance. That was the fastest response we've ever received from the feds. Apparently, they don't want me to testify about our electricity grid reliability or pursuit of carbon neutrality by 2050 after all. Wonder why? At least that's what Danielle Smith would like us to believe. Because it turns out that's not at all what happened. So much so that the head of the committee released a letter on October 12th where he said, Dear Premier Smith, thank you for your letter expressing your desire to appear before the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. As chair, I'm ready to inform you that on October 17th, the committee will not be holding a meeting on the matter we had hoped to discuss with Suncor CEO Rich Kruger, who had been invited to explain why his company is abandoning its climate targets that had previously laid out in the face of a climate emergency. Mr. Kruger has declined to appear, which does not allow the committee to move ahead as planned. Our agenda for October 17th is dedicated to welcoming the Federal Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development, Jerry DeMarco, to discuss his latest report. Moreover, the motion, now moot, that was adopted inviting Mr. Kruger was very specific in the terms of the individuals the committee wished to receive, Rich Kruger and Alberta ministers Brian Jean and Nathan Neudorf. Should the committee wish to invite yourself or others in connection with the matter of the upcoming emissions cap on the oil and gas sector, a motion to that effect would need to be presented to the committee and adopted by a majority of its members. So, to be clear, Danielle Smith wasn't uninvited. She just wasn't invited. But she chose to go to social media in the same style as she did with her being locked out of Facebook and completely misrepresent the situation. Now, of course, this question came up on your province, your premier, and Smith, in probably the most embarrassing way possible, decided to clarify.
On the Shay Ganem program yesterday or Thursday this week, that you were invited to appear in Ottawa before a parliamentary committee and then were uninvited for your appearance. Mr. Ganem said something to the effect of there was no committee, so you were not uninvited. And frankly, Premier, this sounds quite confusing to me, and a little bit like the Twitter or Facebook quote-unquote ban that Mr. Ganem had said simply did not happen. And I wonder if Premier would comment or clarify on, A, what the parliamentary committee invitation was and was not, and why that didn't come to pass, and B, the correct, if there is one, characterization for the media coverage on these two events. But good morning.
Sure, happily. Let me start with that one. On October 5th, my energy minister, Brian Jean, and my electricity minister, Nathan Neudorf, received an invitation to testify at an October 17th committee meeting of the Environment Committee from 12 p.m. until 1 p.m., and Rich Kruger from Suncor was going to testify at the same time. I have these level of specifics for Shay's benefit so that he knows that it happened. They asked us to respond by October 10th. I responded on behalf of Brian Jean and Nathan Neudorf because I think it's actually quite rude for them to come and ask and summons my ministers who were responding with my direction under my mandate and not ask me. They didn't ask for Rich Kruger's VPs to come. They asked for him to come because he's the boss. So I answered on behalf of the government of Alberta. We had started sending over our documents. And then on October 12th, they said, you're not invited anymore. They said it was because Rich Kruger was no longer coming, but Rich Kruger is now actually going to appear on October 16th at a different committee. I'm waiting for my invitation, but they haven't sent another invitation to the government of Alberta. So that's how it ended up going down.
And you can't just invite yourself.
Well, I have to tell you, I've spoken to many, many people who have been invited to testify at government committees, and they tell me they swap out all the time, that if you invite one person and they can't make it, they invite somebody else. They just, they chose not to extend the invitation to me. I don't, I can only have conjecture as to why that might be, but I can tell you, I stand ready to go to Ottawa anytime to testify on behalf of our province and our right to manage our own natural resources and our own electricity grid our own way. So if they want to extend the invitation to me directly, I will take it. And if they want to extend an invitation to any of my ministers, I will accept it on their behalf. Now everybody knows.
I wasn't invited, but I was uninvited. They asked for specific people to come. I apparently don't trust Brian Jean and Nathan Neudorf to represent my government or my position or the position of this government. So I have to go myself because there's a microphone. My God, you can't expect me to walk away from that. So Danielle Smith admits, on one hand, that she was not the person who was invited. It's almost as if, and she's offended, it's quite rude, she says, that she wasn't the person invited. It's almost as if a committee would think, perhaps we shouldn't be summoning premiers for everything related to a province. perhaps we should be bringing the people who the Premier has decided she believes are competent enough to be responsible for those portfolios, the people to whom she's delegated these areas of immense responsibility. Perhaps we should have those people come and not drag the Premier. But Smith can't handle not being the person invited to be the one in front of the microphone. And she's indignant that Mr. Kruger is going to speak at a different committee. So he declined to come to this committee. He's going to go speak to a different committee, and Danielle Smith still feels like she was somehow uninvited, even though she recognizes she wasn't invited. The amount of vanity and ego and detachment from reality is really quite impressive. And I wish I could say that's the worst of what we got out of your province, your Premier, this go around. But it wasn't. It actually got a whole lot worse.
Ask Jim Dinning, Moinyaya, and Mary. Oh my goodness, the person who used to be on the head of the CPPIB board. Sorry, I've forgotten her name. 3-person panel that is going to be doing a broad-based consultation. We're starting with 5 telephone town halls so that people can give their feedback.
Right now, that's starting on Monday, but there's no planned in-person engagements, as I understand.
Yeah, we got, I think, 300,000 people that participated in our in-person engagements before.
Now, I just want to take a second. I really want to let this clip marinate. I really want the weight, the significance of what we're talking about in this clip really settle in. I want to give everybody a chance to really hear it. So we're going to play it again and see if anything jumps out at you. Because there were 2 things in particular that very much jumped out at us.
Ask Jim Dinning, Moinyaya, and Mary. Oh my goodness, the person who used to be on the head of the CPPIB board. Sorry, I've forgotten her name. 3-person panel that is going to be doing a broad-based consultation. We're starting with 5 telephone town halls so that people can give their feedback.
Right now, that's starting on Monday, but there's no planned in-person engagements, as I understand.
Yeah, we got, I think, 300,000 people that participated in our in-person engagements before.
You heard the number, right? The reason why Danielle Smith has said there won't be any in-person town halls is because when the Fair Deal panel originally rolled out their town halls, of which there were 10, there were 300,000 people that attended. Now, you don't have to work very hard to do the math on that. Because if there were 10 town halls that occurred across the province, and there were 300,000 people that attended these in-person town halls, those were her words, that's 30,000 people at a town hall. The Saddle Dome doesn't even hold that many people. We actually looked up how many people the Saddle Dome could hold because we were so, the fact that she doesn't remember the names of the people who are on this very important panel to determine whether or not Alberta leaves the CPP is one thing in and of itself. But the fact that she was comfortable claiming that 300,000 people attended the town halls, and that's why they decided to go with the phone town halls, is really quite something. The Saddle Dome, for the record, holds just under 20,000 people. So you'd actually need a Saddle Dome and a half to host just one of the 10 town halls that the Fair Deal panel actually put together. Now, you would think, as we did, that's quite a number to throw out there, 300,000. I bet if we were to take a look at the Fair Deal report, that we could probably confirm those numbers. Now, we were able to find some media reports, and that's where we were able to get the total number of Albertans who are engaged with the Fair Deal panel. So this is not just town halls. This is online surveys. This is emails. This is all of the different ways that the Fair Deal panel reached out to Albertans. The total number was 40,000. According to multiple media reports, the number of people who attended the Fair Deal panel was 2,500. But there's Danielle Smith justifying the reasons for no in-person consultations by saying 300,000 people attended the in-person town halls, which if you take even but a heartbeat to think about it, it becomes painfully clear there's no way that's possible. Now, I know some people would hear us say, we looked at the CBC and that's where we got our 40,000 total people engaged. That's where we got our 2,500 total people engaged at town halls from. If you really want to be right, you should go to the Fair Deal report. You should read the Fair Deal report. And we thought, you know what? Let's be proactive. Let's go see if we can find the Fair Deal report and let's read what the actual numbers are, because it's for sure going to be in there. But here's the kicker to this whole debacle. It's not available. If you go to the Government of Alberta website, and this has gone on for at least 24 hours because we checked this yesterday and we checked it right before we went to air. You cannot access, you get an error 404 if you try to find the Fair Deal report on the Government of Alberta websites right now. So you have the Premier of the province referencing that report as justification for the limited engagement, the lack of in-person engagement. And if you, as a citizen of Alberta, want to go read the report on the government website that you paid for with taxpayer dollars, it's not currently available. This is Alberta in 2023. This is after Danielle Smith took a victory lap on the latest provincial update program, which comes out every second Thursday, where she talked about the incredible technical advances that had been made in regards to IT at the Government of Alberta. But somehow, during a consultation period to rip Albertans away from the Canada Pension Plan, where there has been inconsistent information from the very get-go, where the Premier of the province gets the number of people who attended the in-person sessions wrong by like 2 orders of magnitude. They don't have the report available to the public. To say nothing of the fact, Danielle Smith is trying to convince everyone, you know what, you should really trust me to handle your retirement money. You should trust me to handle your pension. I don't know the difference between 300,000 people and 2,500, but you should trust me with your money. It's absolutely mind-blowing. And it gets to the last video clip we're going to play in just a couple of minutes before we open it up to our open mic, which we're going to do in just a sec. But we got a couple other quick things that we got to talk about. And this is where we do have to talk a little bit about David Parker and Take Back Alberta.
Parker, the executive director of Take Back Alberta, made this post, quote, "Dear leadership of Alberta Health Services, we are coming for you and we will not rest until your evil communist ideology is eradicated from the face of this province," unquote. Now, after that post, David Shepherd, who is the NDP health critic for primary and rural care in Alberta, issued this statement. Quote, "I'm deeply concerned by the threats made by David Parker of Take Back Alberta towards the Albertans who work to keep our hospitals open and our ambulances on the road. Parker is a hateful extremist and a close friend and ally of Danielle Smith. He claims the credit for Smith's premiership. His organization claims to hold half the seats on the United Conservative Party's board and that they aim to take the other half. As elected officials, we must speak out against this kind of hateful language. Danielle Smith must immediately denounce David Parker's threats and attempts at intimidation of healthcare workers. She must tell Albertans if the hateful extremism of Take Back Alberta has indeed set up shop in the Premier's office, unquote. Your response, Premier Smith.
You know, I'm my own person. I think people know that. I think people know that I consult widely and broadly. I listen to Albertans. I listen to stakeholders. I am not controlled by any one person. I am not controlled by an advocacy group.
What about your response to Parker's post on X?
You know what? There's lots of posts on X from lots of people. I think that they should go and respond and ask David Parker what he means himself. I'm too busy to monitor every single post from every single person on Twitter. I listen to Albertans. I take my advice from my caucus, from my cabinet, and we're moving forward with governing Alberta. I think that this little game that everybody is playing, it sounds like junior high school. I'm not interested. So let's elevate the conversation and let's talk about real issues.
Danielle Smith is too busy. She's a very busy lady. She's too busy to address the comments that Mr. Parker made. Not too busy to invite herself on a cross-Canada trip to a committee meeting. Not too busy for that, because you get to fly in the plane and you get the little bags with the little cookies, and they're all individually wrapped, and you get the little chocolate chip in the oatmeal, and it's quite you get the little cups with the little bit of. Sometimes they let you have the whole can, and you get to pour it in yourself. It's all very exciting, and now she has to miss out on that. She's got the time for that, but she doesn't have the time to condemn David Parker's tweets. David Parker, whose wedding she attended, the angriest of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtlenecks. He's got no influence on her. He's got no control on her. It's not like he said that he owns the board already and intends to make sure that Take Back Alberta has the other half of the board recently, like a week ago.
And every year, half of the board of the party that governs this province is elected. 1 year ago, 900 Albertans showed up at the River Cree Casino, and we elected, I see one here today, Vince Byfield, your Edmonton guy. And we elected 9 TBA board members out of 9 that were open. But there are 18 board members because they're elected every 2 years. They serve 2 terms, and they're elected every other year. We have a half-finished job to finish.
Seems like it's pretty clear he wants to come back for the rest of the board. It's not the first time he said it. Parker's been quoted in multiple stories as saying this is a job that is only half done. Months later in Grand Prairie, he exclaimed that the 2023 United Conservative AGM in Calgary, the other half of the provincial board, gets elected. So start saving up your money. We've got to go to Calgary, and we have to finish this job. And what's his rationale? Well, let's take a look right from the story that we're quoting here. Leaders come and go, folks. He tells the crowd, we need to control the party that's in power. Take Back Alberta has, by Parker's estimation, 30,000 members. Since rallying to knock out Kenny, it has continued organizing within the UCP, winning positions on constituency boards and supporting candidates including Chelsea Petrovic and Livingston McLeod and Eric Bouchard in Kenny's old riding of Calgary-Lougheed. In October, Take Back Alberta mobilized en masse to vote in half the governing board of the UCP. This is referring to the previous AGM. The second half comes up for election this year, and Parker says that's the next goal, the very fulcrum of the party. The board can remove the party membership of any member with a majority vote, including a leader. Parker tells the Grand Prairie crowd they determine nominations, they determine disputes. So Mr. Parker makes it very clear, and he's quoted in other places as saying it's very simple. If you're in the one making the It's pretty simple. If you're the one in the room making the decisions, you're the one in control, Parker said in an interview. He added that electing Take Back Alberta's to the rest of the board would help. So as much as David Parker wants to talk about, I'm just all for grassroots democracy, he said it on the record with multiple journalists. He wants Take Back Alberta to control the UCP board because the UCP board can determine who gets to be a member, and that includes the leader of the party. So if the Take Back Alberta UCP board decides they don't like the way that Danielle Smith is rolling, they can get rid of her, which is probably why Danielle Smith, who's so busy, couldn't be bothered to say, I condemn Parker's rhetoric. And it's worth noting, his rhetoric has been escalating quite a bit over the last little while. He had this to say about masks just a couple of days ago. Masks do not work. The fact that AHS is trying to push them again shows that hostile and communist ideology has taken over our healthcare system and is defying the democratic will of the people. They must be removed from any decision-making roles. The next day, David Parker said, the beauty of the new right is that we don't care about your credentials. We mock them. They are given to you by corrupt little propaganda machines. They mean nothing and we don't respect them. Your experts are just shills for the current thing. You losers can't even tell the difference between a man and a woman. But the tweet that caused all of the uproar, dear leadership of Alberta Health Services, we are coming for you, and we will not rest until your evil communist ideology is eradicated from the face of this province. Sincerely, Take Back Alberta. Apparently speaking, David Parker speaking for the entirety of Take Back Alberta from his personal Twitter account. Just in case you were confused as to how much weight David Parker carries. Who's making the decisions at Take Back Alberta? Who's in charge of Take Back Alberta? There's David Parker speaking for the entirety of Take Back Alberta. Now, that tweet has since been deleted. It's almost as if there's been some consequences, perhaps, from his somewhat unhinged last few days. He did issue this. It's not an apology. It almost sounds like I got in trouble a little bit. Poor mainstream media, they're so desperate for a boogeyman. To confirm, I do not control Premier Danielle Smith, nor have I ever claimed to. He's just claimed that he wants to be the one holding the string of the guillotine that the leader has to stick their head into. Premier Danielle Smith was elected both by the members of the United Conservative Party and the majority of the people of Alberta. She should and does listen to them. As for me, I'm my own man, and I will say and believe what I believe and think. Politicians represent the people who elected him. That is their role. It is Premier Danielle Smith's job to represent the people who put her into office. As long as she does that, she will never have a problem with me. She has made no promises to me and owes me nothing. Take Back Alberta is and will continue to be an educational institutions, pluralized, that teaches regular Albertans how their political system works and how they can impact it. We've been immensely successful at getting people involved and will inevitably be even more successful in the coming years. The world is run by people who show up. My goal is to get as many people to show up as possible. Ask my Sikh and Muslim friends. A lot of people are going to start showing up. Democracy is beautiful. Apart from my faith in Jesus Christ and his saving grace, it is my most sacred principle. Power to the people. But that's not the only tweet that he recently threw up. He also threw up this one right here. In other news, the woke mob has succeeded in intimidating the Ditchley board to have me removed. So I guess you guys are good at something. That's the same day. It's just a couple of hours after his Danielle Smith doesn't own me. It's roughly a day after dear leadership of Alberta Health Services, we're coming for you and will not rest until your evil communist ideology is eradicated from the face of the province. Now, it's important to know what the Ditchley Foundation is. It's complicated. The easiest way to think about the Ditchley Foundation is if you imagine like a miniature World Economic Forum, that's kind of what the Ditchley Foundation is. They're for COVID mitigation. They want to see global cooperation and economic growth across the world. They actually are they seem to be a surprisingly positive organization. It's fascinating that they wouldn't want their brand to be affiliated with Mr. Parker. Had a bit of a week, Mr. Parker has. It's hard to be the sole, I don't know what, in a organization that wants to call everybody communist. Like, how does a mask? We're back to the Red Menace. That's what is trying to drive this conversation these days is the Red Menace. If somebody can explain to me, and we're going to open up the open mic in just a minute here, and we already have one person who I was actually really hoping to hear from, one person in the queue. So Cassandra will be coming to you in just a sec. But if anybody can explain to me how a mask, how an inanimate object can be communist, or how the leadership of a healthcare organization can be communist, I'd love to know, because I don't get it. I'm not all that terribly bright. But again, these are all the things that Danielle Smith refused to condemn because she's too busy. She could do a radio show on Saturday mornings. She could do the provincial update thinger every 2 weeks on the taxpayer's dime. She could do that. She's got time for that. But she doesn't have the time. She's got time to invite herself across the country to testify at a committee that she wasn't invited to. She could do that. But she can't find the time, especially not in that 2-minute diatribe that she had, to say, you know what, David Parker's comments do not represent me. They do not represent the government. And quite frankly, I don't think that anybody should be speaking that way. I think that it's hyperbolic rhetoric. I think that it devolves the conversation. She couldn't do that. If there's one thing that we think people should take out of tonight's show and our Smith Saying Things segment, 2 hours this has gone, and we haven't even gotten to the open mic yet. It's this. Danielle Smith lies a lot. Danielle Smith went on her radio show, and she said 300,000 people attended in-person town halls for the Fair Deal panel when it was only 2,500. That is a lie. I can say the Premier of Alberta lies. That is a factual statement that I can comfortably make. Now, I'm sure that if Danielle Smith gets asked about it, she'll say that she misspoke. But here's the thing. On the same podcast that we played earlier, where she talked about the Sovereignty Act and how it's a notwithstanding clause, even though you're talking about lower orders of legislation, and it's not that at all, she said something else. She talked about one of the most influential moments in her public speaking career. And it's really worth listening to, because when you listen to this clip and you put it up against all of the things that we've talked about tonight, where Danielle Smith has either misrepresented things, mischaracterized things, or straight up lied, all of a sudden, her comfort level with that makes perfect sense.
It was Dale Carnegie. I took a couple of Dale Carnegie courses, and this one he had was on public speaking. And there was a line I remember in there saying, if you learn how to speak well, people will give you credit for being smarter than you really are. And so I thought, oh, well, I may as well put that out there, because it's one of those things you have to just keep trying at. And they say public speaking is something people fear more than death. So once you get over that hurdle, you really can accomplish anything.
If you say it well, it doesn't matter what you're actually saying. Fundamental principle for the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, right there. That being said, time to open up for the open mic, and we do have Cassandra in the queue. Now, before we go to Cassandra, there's something that I wanted to quickly talk about, because on our last show was a heavy one, and it had to do with a conversation that we had with Cassandra. She has been trying to highlight and trying to gain awareness for the housing crisis, the housing emergency that exists in the province of Alberta right now. This is something she's been talking about for weeks. And last live episode, in an extremely unexpected way, it became profoundly personal, because Cassandra was facing homelessness herself. And we put it out to the breakdown community, if anybody was able to assist her in any way, to please do. I don't know what's going on. I did have a DM exchange with Cassandra about a week ago. Things weren't looking great. So before Cassandra says anything, I want to throw this up, because this was something that we're working on with the folks at abpoly.ca. We've been plugging our merch for a while here, and we're just we're a silly little podcast. We're not in a position to, change the world or find anybody an apartment or a place to live. That's just not within our abilities. But we do believe that if everybody does a little bit, that's how change can actually happen. So this is how we're trying to do our little bit here. I talked a little bit a couple weeks ago about the toque, the cuffed beanie that we were introducing into our merch line. It's getting colder out there, so we're trying to do the winter merch a little bit. We've decided, and we've worked it out with abpoly.ca, any proceeds from the beanie sales are going to go straight to Cassandra to hopefully help her get a little bit of stability. I don't think it's going to be a tremendous amount, but again, if everybody does a little bit, then everybody does a little bit, and that's how things get better. So all of that being said, I'm gonna bring Cassandra in. Hopefully, I mean, I'm sure because it's Cassandra, she's gonna have a bunch of things to say about the 2 hours of content that we rolled out tonight, but hopefully she'll also have a little bit of an update for us. That's maybe some good news, finger crossed. Cassandra, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing okay. It is what it is. Before I get into me, though, I do have a couple things, and I have one thing I want to talk about that's a segue into me. I wanted about C69. I mean, I have no words. I don't think Danielle Smith is that bright, and everybody says she speaks well. I don't see it. I have personally known some really great orators, and she doesn't. To me, she doesn't hit that level. So I don't quite get what everybody's saying. I guess she sounds polished, but I've heard. I don't know. I'm ambivalent about that. But one of the things that really, really I found funny was that whole Energy East thing. The C69 was in no way going to, well, I shouldn't say it in no way, but it had nothing to do with the regulatory process that stops most pipelines. And the regulatory process they're talking about is the fact that to get a pipeline, I mean, ultimately, if you're doing a pipeline, that pipeline is going into another jurisdiction other than your own. And what companies struggle with often is the fact that it's uneven sometimes, depending on where you're going. And so that's all up to provinces. Like if a province says the biggest reason that, I mean, there's a couple other reasons, but the biggest reason that Energy East never happened had nothing to do with the environmental process and everything to do with Quebec saying, no, we don't want any pipelines and we don't want them coming through through Quebec. So, and they gave us the big middle finger, and that's why. And, there was several pipelines that BC had wanted to get through. A funny thing, when Horgan was fighting with Rachel Notley, who, by the way, they're friends, but they went toe to toe, and he was putting all this shade on Trans Mountain. In the meantime, there was three other pipelines. Two of those pipelines I know for sure were going through virgin, untouched forest and ecosystems, including some of the most sensitive coastal ecosystems on the West Coast. And the Trans Mountain actually, it actually goes to a refinery that, ironically, I grew up next to because it was right by my high school. Like when we had lunch and we walked to the store, we walked to this mini mall that was right across the street from the refineries that the Trans Mountain goes to. And it's an already existing pipeline. It's been there for 60 years. And, so longer than I've been alive. And Yeah. And so they were all they did was twin it. So they weren't actually, in order to twin it, they weren't actually breaking any new ground that hadn't already been touched because the pipeline was already there. They were just doubling, just putting, twinning it. And so that was actually of the pipelines, that was the one with the least amount of environmental impact. And Horgan wanted to put a lot of attention on that because the ones that he wanted to get through, I think they were both natural gas, if I remember correctly. He was secretly trying to get these other ones through, and they did not make through the environmental regulatory process that is overseen by the federal government. And it was because, like, literally, if you're going to choose a pipeline, you want to choose. You got three choices, and you want to choose the one with the least amount of environmental impact. You're not going to choose the two that are going through some of untouched, some of the untouched, most delicate ecosystems in our country, let alone the world. You don't want to do that. You want to do the one with the least amount of environmental impact, and one that's just when you're just twinning an already existing pipeline that's been there for 60 years. Of course, that's going to have the least amount of impact. And so, I just want to put that out there. The feds can, in certain circumstances, prevent a pipeline, but often what prevents pipelines going through is the provinces themselves.
Yep.
You know,
Well, I mean, even if you take a look
it's
at
the
the
negotiate,
timeline.
or even going like Keystone XL. That died because it was going into the United States, and a new administration came in and they ran on the fact that if they got in, they were going to stop that from happening. So, like this, it's a fantasy to think that there's anything that we could do to alleviate that. Like like it's just a fantasy. Like, and yeah. Anyway, that's what I have to say about Danielle Smith and her C69
Well, I mean, even
weirdness.
the timeline on Energy East, I think, is worth highlighting because
Oh, that one too. Yeah, I know.
it
Yeah.
was started in 2013. The Liberals
Yeah.
under Justin Trudeau weren't even elected until 2015. C69
Mhm.
didn't come in until 2019, and
Yep.
the pipeline was canceled because Quebec said no in 2017. So to try to say that C69 is in any way responsible for the cancellation of Energy East when C69 didn't exist until 2019 and it was canceled in 2017, it's just
Well,
it's
and
mind-boggling.
to be clear too, the other thing is that because so our the environmental approval process has been wrought, and prior to C69 has been wrought with all kinds of vagueness and which have led to inconsistencies. And there was a big outcry for people, like for the government, get your act together and clarify the language, like tell us exactly, you know what I mean? And so a big part of what C69 was supposed to be about was clearing up the vagueness and inconsistencies and giving a clear roadmap to actually expedite the environmental approval process, not to make it worse than it already was, because it was already really bad. It was to clarify and streamline so that people could get approvals much quicker and not have to wait years. And so that's the other thing that people don't get. So, they, of course, conservative governments want to throw a lot of shade on these things, but the truth of the matter, that is what it was for. And if you know anything about the process prior to that, you would understand why they would want to streamline it. And I just think it just makes it's just utter, yeah. Everything that Danny has to say is complete garbage. She has no idea what she's talking about. She knows nothing about energy. She knows like like, I don't know where she's been, if she's actually been studying since 1999. I don't know where she's been studying, because I looked at it, 6 ways to Sunday, and I'm older than her. And she doesn't know what the hell she's talking about.
Well, 300,000, right?
Right? Like, I know it's anyway. But yeah, that's what I wanted to see. But the other thing I wanted to talk about, and this is the segue. Before I get to that, I have to say something about David Parker, and I have to say, so I don't follow him, but he's actually started showing up in my feed on X. So I don't know what algorithm has made that happen, but and it's not just the things that people take pictures of and tweet. It's actually his actual tweets, and I have to say, surprisingly, I get a lot of entertainment out of it, because I started reading the threads and the comments that people make back to him. And if you're looking, it doesn't really look like he has the support he thinks he has, at least not on X, because people troll the hell out of him, and it's absolutely funny what they come back with.
I don't think that I think that the vast majority of people that he would count as supporters are probably not active on X, because
they're not. I don't know.
Yeah,
technology's hard. Sorry.
I have my own theory that Mr. Parker thrives on perpetual victimhood, but that's just a speculation on my part.
You think?
So, I don't know, maybe.
No, come on.
I'm gonna let you get your segue though.
So anyway, so one of the thing, the arena deal, and this drives me absolutely bananas. I'll tell you, I voted for this mayor. I only voted for her because the candidate that I wanted to support, and that I was actually going to go volunteer. I was volunteering for the federal a federal campaign. So I had to finish that up, and then I was going to start actually volunteering with Kent Harris' campaign for mayor. He dropped out. Now apparently he got sick or something, and because of his conditions and stuff, that particular kind of thing can be more challenging for him. And so that was apparently, but I also know, like, there was a lot of people that didn't want him to run because they really wanted, why can't I it must be late at night. I'm just overexhausted.
It has been a long show.
The mayor, no, it's not even that. It's my day. Anyway, the mayor, I voted for her, because she would have been my second choice. I had great hopes. I asked her a question. I got to ask her a question on Daybreak, Alberta. And it was actually housing related. It was housing and food insecurity and climate related. And she gave a really good answer, which was very encouraging. And, she just, I feel like she falls flat. Like, Mayor Nenshi, I miss him, because he went toe to toe with the government, and he didn't care what party was in power. He went just as hard as at the NDP as he did at the PCs or the UCP. And he didn't care. He'd get into it with them. And she won't do that. Like, she's just not going toe to toe. And I just, that frustrates me. And it frustrates me, this arena deal, that they're spending all this money, Calgary taxpayer dollars, on this arena while people are daily going homeless. It drives me nuts. Like, the vacancy rate in Calgary, it is beyond crazy. In Calgary, this isn't happening in Edmonton, from what I can tell, but it is happening in Calgary. And, because everybody that's moving here, well, they want to be near the mountains and, the lifestyle of Calgary. And anyway, it's driven bidding wars. Like when I go to an apartment, and I'll have somebody that wants to rent to me, apparently, right? And I'll submit an application and they either don't vet my application or I've actually been told that they were going to rent to me right there on the spot. And we were talking, I was texting them my email, they were going to send me an application and all this was going to happen. And then nothing happened. I had a situation where I went to go view a place and the lady told me, she goes, I'm going to be doing a few viewings over the, 2 or 3 days. And then when I'm done, I'm going to make a short list and invite people to apply. And so I told her I had a cat and she hadn't mentioned in the ad either way. And she said, well, I'm not sure about the cat. Like I like cats and my niece that lives upstairs has a cat, but I have to think about it. And her and I really connected and we had a really good conversation about the housing situation and the homelessness situation and stuff. And, I know we really connected and anyway, but I didn't think she was going to call. And then she texts me and she says, can you come by tomorrow at noon? And fill out an application. It wasn't an offer to rent. It was just fill out an application and meet the tenant upstairs, which was her niece. And I was like, okay, sure. And she goes, okay, see you tomorrow. So I'm expecting that she's going to take all these applications and she's going to go through the applications and then she'll decide at a later point. An hour, it was less, just under an hour before I was supposed to be there filling out the application, I get a text message telling me that it's rented. I have had people tell me they were going to rent to me and do stuff and then tell me they basically got an offer they couldn't refuse because people are bidding. They're offering landlords higher rent. Landlords, I walked into a place and I watched this guy had just put this unit up for viewing. I texted and he goes, yeah, sure, I'm going to be here. Just come on down. I was 5 minutes away at my friend's house. And hold on, I got to take a sip. My nose getting dry. And when I got there, he was overwhelmed. This guy was just like leaning up on the thing and he looked exhausted. He looked stressed out and he just was, all he kept saying was, he goes, I'm getting so many applications and so many people and everybody just is so desperate, he says to me. That's what he said. And he goes, and I just, like he was just overwhelmed with the response he was getting for that unit. And yeah, the pressure he was getting from every single person that wanted to rent that unit because of desperation. So that's what I have to say. And so when I hear about we're going to spend all this money on an arena deal, that frustrates me because we need housing. And one of the other things is, and I wrote, and I'll send you my letter to the mayor and the communication back and forth because I wrote a letter to the mayor because she put a motion forward at council. It was her motion she put forward at council to allot some city land and put up temporary modular housing for families. And statistically, single-person households are more than 2 times as likely to be in core housing need than in comparison to those that have more than one person. And that includes single-parent households. And I can tell you, when I was a single parent, there was all kinds of services I could get and all kinds of help I could get just because I had a kid I was taking care of. And the minute that kid grew up, none of that was available to me. And I'm not saying we don't want children on the street. And yes, government should do everything to prevent that from happening. But you cannot do it to the exclusion of such a large segment of the population to the point that you're causing them to go homeless.
Yeah.
And the other thing I found out, like I called 211. I called 211 and like, honestly, all these services, they're referring me in circles. And it's because they're all dealing with the same pool of resources. Like you talk to each one of them, they're literally going over the same resources, and everything that they're offering me is something I've already done.
It doesn't
People have
sound like
tried
you've got
reading
good
off
news
Rent
for us.
Faster, and it's like I look at Rent Faster every single day. I know everything on there. Like honestly, unless it was just put up 2 seconds after I left my computer, I've seen it. And I'm on Kijiji, and I'm on, you know what I mean? So it's frustrating. And but yeah, so that's that. And but anyway, I wrote the mayor the letter, and I showed her statistics about, you know, on homelessness among the other population besides single person households is women and gender diverse. Something that is barely they barely track at all. It's very inconsistent and very in very few cases is they do not track homelessness amongst the disabled population very well. It's up and down. Our city services, when they asked me on 211, for instance, you know, can we get some information for you just to, you know, we want to see which populations are experiencing certain things. And the questions, you know, they asked me were like, am I Indigenous? You know, I'm female. And if, do I have any dependents? And that was pretty much it. There might have been one other question, but the questions were very minimal. And I'm like, are you not tracking like LGBTQ plus people? Like, why aren't you asking about that? Why aren't you asking about disability? Like you need to find out how many people with disabilities are homeless. Like, why is nobody tracking that? And they made a note of it, and hopefully that changes. But it's this is the kind of thing. So, you know, I sent her statistics and just saying, like, why can't you open this up for people that are, you know, that are single person households instead of just families? And the response I got from her office manager or whatever was, I'm sorry this is happening to you, because of course, as always, I use my own personal story to express that, you know, the crisis and stuff. And it was, I'm so sorry this is happening to you. Have you tried 211? Like, I'm like, what? I replied back, and I'm like, seriously, you don't think I've called 211? Like, did you just read my letter? Like, I've done everything. And, you know, and she replied back with an apology, but in the end, completely missed the point that the whole reason I was writing the letter was to say that you're missing this segment of the population, and they're more likely to become homeless than the population that you're doing this modular housing for. And that's what I got to say about that.
Well, Cassandra, I'm going to make the same appeal to the audience that I made last week. If anybody has any lines on any accommodations, any rentals in Calgary that will take a cat, and Cassandra, her Twitter handle is at MOPARMAIDENBC. And I just really hope that we can get you see you in housing somehow.
I might have a plan in place. I was supposed to be out today. My landlord had extended my time for. I asked for a week. He gave me 2 weeks, but everything fell through. My age worker was trying to get me approved to move my stuff into storage. That fell through. His supervisor wouldn't sign off on it. They said I had to have a residence to go to, and then they would pay for it. Yeah, I mean, I won't even go into that whole conversation. There was a couple of points, and I know my worker. I tell him, I don't blame you, but what you're telling me is actually quite frustrating. But yeah, it's ridiculous. Like, nobody will help me out of this situation, not the people that are supposed to. But anyway, that fell through, and I'm still like, I've had help packing, but my body just doesn't move. So I've been cleaning and stuff. So I just texted my landlord and I just said, look, I want to be out, but this fell through and I need to pack. I need to clean and pack. And there's no way I'm getting out on the 15th. My daughter's going to come out for a day or two to help me clean. It's pretty much packed. And then I don't know. I'm going to try to get a closer storage unit. So hopefully transporting my stuff to the storage unit will be cheaper. And also you asked me if I got any help. I actually, a fellow I know who's a Facebook friend, but I've never met in person, Mike Bonner, actually, reached out to me and said, I heard you on the breakdown, and offered me, he's got a truck and he said he could help like move some stuff or offer me some help that way. So maybe I can move some stuff slowly out. He can't help with furniture or anything because he's got a bad back too. But we maybe can move some stuff and take some stuff to the remaining stuff to Goodwill, and so something good did come out of it. Sorry, I'm really tired and.
No, it's all good. I really hope that when we chat next week, you'll have some more good news, I'll say.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I might. What it's looking like at this point, I'm waiting on a couple of things, and if they fall through, the plan is I'm going to put my stuff in storage and probably head up to Edmonton. I have a place I can temporarily lay my head with my cat, and I'm trying to do a lease takeover. I might not get approved because of my credit is just below what they look for. But I'm going to try, and if not, I can stay there for a short time. And the vacancy rate up in Edmonton is something like 3 or 4%. I don't understand, but yeah,
it's Edmonton. I mean,
yeah, I know everybody wants to be in Calgary, and I get it. I love Calgary. I lived in Edmonton for 9 years. I mean, it's okay.
I mean, I was
I got
born
a lot
there.
of
I don't
friends up
remember
there.
any
A lot
of
of
it,
people want me to, like, a lot of people really, really want me to move up there.
Well, if you got some supports, that sounds like a great option.
Yeah, I know. I got so much going that I've gotten going in Calgary with my advocacy and people I've connected with, and I you know I was going to be one of the raging grannies, and yeah, like I had all this, so it's hard to let it go. I also have a good doctor here, and so yeah, it's kind of hard to let it all go, but it at this point, the way the housing situation is, I just don't see many other options.
There we go.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you'll keep us updated. I'll be bugging you with the DM midweek to hopefully try to get some news again. So I hope that's okay. And
yeah, absolutely.
Hopefully we see a slew of toques moving out the door to maybe get
I
you a
would
little
love
bit of
that.
gas money.
I appreciate that. Like, my landlord gave. It's funny because my landlord gave me a bit of a break to hopefully pay. Help pay for moving costs, which I was great. But I still couldn't quite, like, in order to cover the last quote I got. Like, it would leave me absolutely broke, and I need the money to drive up to Edmonton, where I've got a warm roof that I can sleep under with my cat. And yeah,
Easier to get to the legislature though.
I know.
I'm not saying. I'm just saying.
Well, trust me, I'll be there lots.
Awesome. All right, Cassandra, thank you so much. And yeah,
thank you.
Oh, yeah, no, of course.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate, like, it was out of left field when you guys told me that, and it literally put me in tears, and I really appreciate it, and I also appreciate you for all the times you've given me a voice, even when it's not about me. I appreciate it a lot.
No, I'm not going anywhere. And I'm told that most days the internet works in Edmonton as well. So we'll still hopefully be able to hear from you.
I lived in Edmonton for 9 years. I know the lay of the land. I'll be good.
There we go. All right. I'm going to bring in, we got one other person in the queue. I'm going to bring in, this could be interesting. I'm going to take a dramatic pause in case there needs to be editing done for the podcast version. For anybody who's made it to 2 hours and 41 minutes of the podcast version of this, we have a person. I don't know what a person wants to say. I'm not going to make any assumptions, but if a person is there, if you want to unmute yourself. And they've unmuted, but they're not making any noise. So I'll vamp for a second, and then we'll. Oh, we got Tammy. So I'm going to bring in Tammy right now, and if a person figures out how to make their microphone work, then we'll go from there. But Tammy, what's going on? Oh, Tammy's not. It's coming up to 3 hours. It's totally understandable that everybody's tapped out.
Okay, there we go.
Oh, there we go.
I got it now.
How's it going?
Oh, not too bad. Oh, so much bad going on.
Right?
I know. It's just awful. So I at least count it as a good because we have farmland and because I'm very like I understand all of the stuff with the selenium that the mining is gonna put into the water. So I actually got accepted by the AER to put in I made it in the 3 days or whatever after I can't think of his name. You know me with my stroke thing.
Yep.
With he put out the thing on Twitter and said, "Hey, they're at it again." And I went, "Oh, crud." But yeah, I actually got the thing into the AER with all of the veterinary documentation about why the selenium that the mining will put in the water is really, really bad and really, really bad for southern Alberta. Because one of the things, like most people, when they think of the selenium poisoning, and I'll admit I'm the same type. I think of the animals, right? Because it causes low birth rates and basically animals will abort their offspring because of the drinking the selenium contaminated water. Because selenium is one of these things, and trolls like to say, "Oh, but farmer trolls say, but we need to give animals selenium." Yeah, selenium is one of these things where a little bit is good and a lot is toxic.
As with most things.
As with most things. But the worst thing is that most of the plants that we grow, like wheat and alfalfa and barley, they collect the selenium. When you're growing it, they collect the selenium in the water that you might be irrigating with, especially in southern Alberta, where water tends to be, needed to be, like, you can't depend on the water that the sky gives. You actually have to pull water out of the ground, which, oh gee, if you're poisoning the water by the mining, which has happened in BC. There's at least one place in BC that they're actually still trucking water in because of the water being poisoned by the mining they were doing. If we do that in southern Alberta, the wheat, the barley, the alfalfa that gets grown in that area will no longer be fit for use.
To me, the thing where I just keep bumping on it is, and I realize like I'm looking for logical consistencies from 300,000. The premier here doesn't know the difference between 300,000 and 2,500. But to me, if you're going to put a renewables moratorium in place because you're concerned. One of the big reasons is because you're concerned about the farmland, you're concerned about the farmers, you're concerned about the landscapes. I don't know how, after the previous government has already said no to this project, given that she's the boss, as she said, it's not Brian Jean, it's her. I don't know how she's allowing it to go through. Like it boggles the mind.
But it's not. Right? That's their excuse. That's their, you have to always kind of look at what's going on underneath the surface. So the moratorium isn't about worrying about, the renewables, except for their buddies in oil and gas that they don't want renewable energy.
Yeah.
They don't want it. So it's not about what they're saying. It's about who they're protecting underneath.
Yep.
Right? It's the same thing as with this coal mining thing. It's not about, them snooping it in. It's about industry. That is all that the Alberta government cares about. That is all the UCP doesn't care about. They could care less if they kill people, if they destroy other people's jobs, including they don't care that they're going to wreck tourism in areas where they're doing the mining. Why? Because as far as they're concerned, that doesn't make them money. Because believe it or you got to believe it, is what those guys are working at. They're not working for us, right? They don't really care what happens to us. Because when they get out of their gig in the government, they have fat cat jobs waiting for them. Look at what happened with Jason.
Yeah, Mr. Kenny did okay.
Right? There are fat cat jobs working for them and waiting for them. And the more kinds of things they do like this, the more friends they have in industries, the more places they have to go when eventually they get booted. And they've wrecked everything. And then we bring in somebody like the NDP who come in, they start trying to clean things up. But the idiots, and I'm not nice about it, you know that.
Oh, I do.
The idiots go, oh, well, they're not letting us do X, Y, or Z. Well, because letting people do X, Y, and Z, look what it did to us last time. Oh, but we need to do that. So we're going to vote against the NDP again because they're communists,
Well, everybody's a communist. Apparently, masks are communists now. I didn't even.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other thing that's got me in a twist right now is this entire, what do you call it? Temporary part-time work in Alberta. Well, it just ticks me the heck off. Okay, so I've had a stroke. 2 strokes, cancer. But previous to that, I was a BA, a business analyst, specifically what they call a technical business analyst, which means I am really good at anything to do with a computer. Anything to do with a computer. But when I got out after my strokes, even though all of my skills were still there, once I could speak and everything else, I realized that one of the things that really got to me about working now was working as a contractor. And that is what, if you go for certain jobs, you now in Alberta cannot find full-time permanent work. You can't even find part-time permanent work in those sorts of jobs because they don't hire you as an employee. They hire you as a contractor. Now, I don't know how contracting falls into the employment. I don't know if it actually falls in as full-time work or what have you. I have a tendency to think that it probably doesn't, but goodness knows. But the problem is that for a lot of people, contracting sounds like a really good idea. And I even had a little bit of a conversation with an NDP fellow that apparently did do some contracting in his day. And I said, well, one of the things they use as a kind of a lure to get people to contract is that it sounds like it's a lot, you make a lot more money. But that's only if you don't actually look under the hood, as it were. Mm-hmm. Because contracting means you're responsible for everything. It's a way for the companies to offload all of the things that they have to pay for, to offload those things onto the person who they're hiring. Right? So as a contractor, I would have to pay my CPP if I wanted to. Yeah. I had to pay my EI. You had to basically set up, instead of being covered by WCB by the company, you actually had to have your own account with WCB that then you would pay into. Otherwise, you weren't covered by WCB if you were hurt on the job. You had to carry your own business insurance. So when you start adding up all those things and that sort of thing, number one, you're not actually making more money. They're just offloading those costs onto you. And then the second thing is that, and this was the part that got me, was it's really stressful. Do you think it's not? But it really is. Mm-hmm. Because they can drop contracts like that.
Yeah.
And as someone who's had a stroke, I need a little bit of reassurance that if I'm doing it at my job, that my job isn't just going to disappear next week. So, I mean, how I got around it was, and I'm lucky that I don't work for a company in Alberta. I work for a company in Toronto, remote work. And they're a great company, right? But not everybody has that opportunity. And now that's why there's so many people being stuck in these dead-end, part-time jobs that they can't live on. They're working like 2 of those dead-end part-time jobs if they can find 2 that work together for hours, like for fitting your work.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm just like, man, oh man, I'm glad I've got the job I do. But this entire thing that the Alberta government keeps pushing, and again, this is something that the Alberta government, under the UCP, covertly supports. Because they do it themselves.
Yep.
A lot of the Alberta government jobs now, they're all contracted. I know, because before I got this one with Avic, the company that I work for in Toronto, I had basically gone, well, I can't not, so I'll take a contracting job in a position that I found super, super boring, but I also knew that I'd excel at, because I was just using my BA skills. I wasn't using my computer skills. So I seemed like a superstar. To me, I was bored as heck. But then Avic came and rescued me, and now I'm like in my dream job. But that doesn't always happen. And I feel for people, especially people here in Alberta, who don't have a job that can easily translate into something that somebody somewhere else is willing to make you a remote worker, or has a kind of skill set that you can't do remotely. Because, I mean, that's why so many Albertans are in such trouble right now. And the sad part is the UCP are basically, they're like with everything else, what they're doing, they support those things that are hurting people. And I don't think that certain parts of Alberta, the population of Alberta, still haven't figured that out yet.
I feel you. But that's one of the reasons why having conversations is so important, and making sure that people hear this stuff is so important. Because if we do this all in silos, I mean, as much as I love making fun of David Parker, the guy's not wrong that people need to be engaged and people need to pay more attention. So, I mean, good on you for continuing to show up. I'm going to jump off you, Tammy, for a sec, because I have a person has re-requested and I have like 10% left on my battery. So.
Oh, go.
Perfect. All right. I'm going to give a person another chance to unmute themselves, and hopefully the microphone works. And
is this working?
It sure is.
Yeah. Thank you so much for getting on. I didn't think I'd get it. I don't know how Twitter or X, whatever, works, but I'm glad I got the microphone to actually work.
You sure did. So what's going on tonight?
Not much. I just want to circle back to a super obscure point for some reason. You mentioned one of the multiple motions that the UCP made, specifically the motion about professional organizations.
I did.
And I thought that was an interesting thing. And I have maybe a little bit of a different take than you, because you seem to be humorously tying towards the Child Shandro situation, if I'm not mistaken.
That's not what I'm not saying that I was tying it to anything, but there's certainly no.
But you're not saying, but you may be saying.
There's lots of wheels in motion at any given point in time, is all I'm going to say.
Okay. I disagree. I don't think it's anything to do with that at all. I think that this is specifically the Jordan Peterson.
Oh, totally. That's the impetus for this. I have no doubts.
Yeah, it's. I mean, yeah, and it's interesting to look at this. The UCP is thoroughly based its entire policy on this online culture war BS, and the amount of resources it's spending on it, both sort of intellectually and financially, is such a shame, because they could be spending that sort of energy and that sort of money on things that would actually do help for people. Like, I walk to get groceries and I see a billboard that says, don't let, whatever, the freeze in the dark the billboard.
Yeah.
Advertising. I've spent too much time on YouTube and I've seen things about the CPP thing. And it's just like, however much money has been spent is just throwing that money into the sun. And I think about all the problems that people talked that have before me with more problems and more immediate need than me have enumerated, and think like that's money that could be spent helping those issues.
100%.
It's so pointless. So, like, because we have a government that does not live in the reality of reality, instead it really lives in the reality of online culture wars and online and worrying about whatever Jordan Peterson is up to. Like, who cares? Who cares what Jordan Peterson has been suspended from the college of... Like, for me to explain that all is a waste of everyone's time. Whoever's familiar with that situation, I feel for you because it doesn't matter.
Yep.
Like, I had a conversation with my mother about this situation to some degree. And it's just like, my mother is not as politically engaged and is further to the right of me politically, but she works in healthcare. She understands how professional organizations in healthcare work. And she understands that this whole thing, this whole culture war nonsense about the whole thing is so ridiculous.
Oh, entirely. And I mean, see, the kicker to me is the things that he was taken to task on with his professional society were arguing he was using his credentials as a psychologist specifically to speak to certain issues. And I think there's a big difference between somebody saying something stupid on the internet and saying something stupid on the internet and then trying to validate it by saying, and because of what I do professionally, you should listen to me. I think those are two very, very different things. And I think that there's room for people to speak their minds and voice their opinions. But I think as soon as you start to leverage your professional accreditation for credibility on issues that are unrelated to your professional accreditation, then you should not do that.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, it seems pretty simple, but what do I know?
It's true, but it's just like, why are we talking about this? Why do I care?
Why is this a provincial policy?
Why do I care about the, why is this whole thing, this is federally a thing too, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was a thing at
CPC.
No, the CPC had a thing about that as a policy at their convention.
Yep.
Because like that's a thing we should be concerned about, is the fact that this one psychologist got his license suspended, a thing that does not affect his life at all because he's not practicing psychology as a consultant.
Yep.
I'm sorry.
It's
babbling.
It's all very dumb. I hear you, man.
It's just like, why do we care? Why is anybody at a government level caring about this? There's like 100 issues more important than this.
It almost seems like they're fostering the very junior high conversations that they're complaining about, some might say.
Some might say. I have more faith in junior high students than that.
Right?
But that's just me. Anyway. I don't know if I have much more to say. Our provincial government doesn't live in reality, and that means that their priorities are not based in reality, and that means they don't help people based in reality. That's my thought.
I like it. Thanks for tapping in. I'm glad we were able to get things working for you. I'm going to bring in one more person. We'll see how this goes. and then I literally am going to have no choice but to shut it down because my power supply is looking at me sideways and is not at all approving of what's going on in my universe. So we're going to see if we can squeak this out. I am Frog. This will go well. I mean, if it's not Spider-Man, I got nothing to complain about. What's going on?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, can I tell you a little story?
I mean, I reserve the right to cut you off at any time, depending on the content of the story, but yeah.
No problem. Okay, so David Parker and Craig Chandler decided they'd come into Cochrane and see what they could do about overthrowing the mayor by doing recall legislation and kicking off this big campaign to get the 8,000 to 10,000 signatures that they need to overthrow the mayor and scare everybody in town. Long story short, people in town really didn't like Take Back Alberta showing up and Craig Chandler. And basically what ended up happening is basically nobody showed up to their little rally. So that's kind of a good way to end off tonight. I think that it's nice to see that they claim to have a lot more influence than they actually do is what I think. So
there we go. Well, thank you for sharing that little. I mean, here's the thing. I believe in my heart of hearts that the David Parkers of the world do a very, very good job of aggravating and agitating and getting people fired up over issues like masking's communist, whatever, man. Just because you're using buzzwords doesn't mean that's at all what's actually going on. But I think that they're very, very good with a small subset of people. I mean, let's look at it this way. The population of Alberta is well north of 4 million people last I checked. And the UCP is, David Parker's big brag right now is that the UCP is set up to have their biggest political convention ever with, he says, 3,000 to 4,000. Danielle Smith went on her radio show yesterday and said 2,100. So, I mean, that's a very small group of people that are very, very activated, that are going to be making some decisions that the rest of the province is absolutely going to have to deal with. But at the end of the day, it's still only 3,000 people out of 4 million and a bunch. So I think there's a lot more people who are looking at the situation going like, what is going on? The trick of it is, and it's good to hear that Cochrane said, no, thank you. But I think the trick of it is that we have to get more people willing to say no, thank you, politely. And that's how we're going to move things forward. So that's my thoughts on that. Anything else you wanted to add in before my battery dies here?
Yeah, no, I just want to say totally agree. And just people be on the lookout for them. Coming into town, there's potential that their next stop will be Chestermere. So they plan 32 stops, as from what I'm hearing. So just be on the lookout. You'll probably see them close to where you live. So everyone have a good night.
That sounds like the worst movie preview in the history of movie previews. At a theater near you.
Yeah. the theater or the movie you really don't want to see. So.
There you go. Well, thanks, man. Appreciate that. Thanks for. I don't think I've seen the I Am Frog before, so thanks for your first time calling in on the show as well.
I just staying anonymous on Twitter. That's all. But
good for you. That's what all the cool kids do. I'm told. There's folks that behave badly if you don't. All right. Thanks, man. You have a good night. And I'm going to wrap things up because we are now at the over 3-hour mark, which is absolutely ludicrous. Thank you I want to say big thank you to everybody who's listening on Twitter Spaces, but I want to say especially big thank you to everybody who has hung out on the chat. The folks that we have who engage in the chat, whether it's on the YouTube and the Facebook, usually the Facebook is a little bit more combative, I'll say. But the YouTube chat is always amazing to see. You guys are absolutely just a wonderful. It's so great to watch this little community interact and chat and everything, and occasionally tell me that I'm getting stuff wrong, and occasionally tell me that I'm getting stuff right. It's a warm, fuzzy feeling. So I want to say thank you to everybody there. If you're listening to the podcast version of this, I want to say thank you for making it. This is an insanely long. I think this might actually be the longest one that we've ever done. So, way to power through. Give yourself a cookie. And with that, I'm going to do the obligatory plugs and wrap it up because it's past my bedtime and my phone's getting ready to die on me here. So all of that being said, I want to replug the toque, the beanie that is available at abpoly.ca. This was a decision that we made in conjunction with the folks at abpoly.ca. All proceeds are going to go to benefit Cassandra and help her get through the thing that she's trying to get through. This is the first time we've done something like this. We're not a huge show with a whole lot of clout, so we're trying to do the little bit that we can. But if you want to keep your head and ears warm over the coming winter months, it's a great way to do it, and it will feel extra warm because it comes with warm fuzzies. I'm told. While you're at abpoly.ca, we do also have all of our other merch. So we got the mugs, we got the t-shirts, we got the hoodies, we got the other t-shirts where you can, there's a lot to unpack here because apparently I say that a lot. And then we also have the tagline for the end of the show, which I'm going to say in about 90 seconds. The other thing I have to mention is if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, you can always sign up to be one of our Patreon supporters at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue. And we got some FOIP requests coming back. We FOIPed two things. We as soon as the campaigns for the Tell the Feds came out and the Alberta Pension Plan advertising campaign came out, we FOIPed both of those, and then they went ahead and released the figures anyways. So no news there. But there is a website that they purchased that has been registered since 2013. So presumably either Danny was saving that one up for a rainy day or somebody got paid so they could use it. And we're waiting to see how much taxpayers paid so that we didn't have to put a hyphen in the Alberta Pension Plan website. Looking forward to getting the results back. We're able to do those FOIP requests because of the support that we get from our Patreon supporters. So again, if you're able to, www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab. And I will say we posted an exciting new update, exclusive. Everybody's going to find out what it is eventually. But right now, it's exclusive to our Patreon supporters. And you're getting a sense of what we're working on. It should be ready for our Christmas special, which may or may not include a road trip. Haven't decided yet. We'll see what we see. But thank you to everybody. I want to say a big thank you to the comments moderator who's lurking over to my left, who helps occasionally with writing lines. And if I don't say this now, I'm going to get in all kinds of trouble. The rabbit holes get dark line that was written by them. They're going to remain anonymous. But we got some folks who do some writing on the show, and they came up with that one. And so I want to give full credit to them. All of that being said, we're not going to do 2-week break anymore because 3 hours is way too long. So we'll see you next Sunday, 8 o'clock. We have some interviews coming up as well that we're going to be releasing. Haven't recorded any of them yet. They're just scheduled, so we're not going to ruin the surprises there. But we're 2 weeks away from the legislature back in session. Things are going to get really interesting real quick. So rest up, take care of yourselves, and as always, keep the conversation going.